This is the entire history of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the quiet halls of the British Museum, amid the dust of centuries and the whispers of forgotten voices, a young man named George Smith bent over fragments of ancient clay. The year was 1872, and the November light filtered weakly through London's industrial haze, casting shadows across tables laden with broken tablets covered in mysterious wedge-shaped marks. Smith, just 32 years old, worked methodically through pieces that had journeyed across continents and millennia, each fragment a puzzle piece in humanity's oldest surviving story. What Smith held in his hands that November day would shake Victorian England to its foundations. The tablet, catalogued simply as K.3375, bore cuneiform characters that spoke of a great flood, of a boat filled with animals, of divine judgment and human survival. As Smith's practiced eyes moved across the weathered surface, recognition dawned with stunning clarity. Here, preserved in Mesopotamian clay, was a story remarkably similar to the biblical account of Noah's flood. But this version preceded the Hebrew scriptures by more than 1,000 years. The discovery represented far more than an archaeological curiosity. Smith had stumbled upon what scholars would come to recognize as the oldest surviving piece of epic world literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. This ancient narrative, composed in the shadowy millennia before Homer sang of Achilles and Odysseus, contained within its clay-baked lines the first recorded explorations of questions that continue to haunt humanity. What is the meaning of life? How should we face death? What defines true friendship? How do we find wisdom amid suffering? The journey of this epic through time represents one of the most remarkable stories of cultural transmission in human history. Born in the oral traditions of ancient Sumer sometime before 2100 BCE, the tale evolved through successive civilizations, languages, and cultural contexts. It survived the collapse of empires, the transformation of languages, the conversion of religions, and the passage of nearly 4,000 years before scholars like Smith could once again piece together its fragmentary remains and hear the voice of Gilgamesh speaking across the void of ages. Smith's background made his achievement all the more extraordinary. Born into London's working class in 1840, he had ended his formal education at 14 when apprenticed to a banknote engraving firm. Yet his fascination with the ancient world drove him to spend his lunch hours at the British Museum, teaching himself to read the wedge-shaped cuneiform script that archaeologists had recently begun recovering from Mesopotamian ruins. His unusual talent for assembling coherent passages from scattered fragments caught the attention of Henry Creswick Rawlinson, one of the pioneering scholars who had helped decipher cuneiform in the previous decades. By 1867, Smith had impressed Rawlinson sufficiently to earn employment at the museum, tasked with cataloguing and translating the enormous collection of tablets that Austin Henry Layard and his assistant Hormuzd Rassam had excavated from Nineveh during the 1840s and 1850s. These expeditions had uncovered the ruins of the great library assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE. Ashurbanipal, the last of the great Assyrian monarchs, had aspired to gather all known cuneiform writings into his collection. His obsessive bibliophilia would prove humanity's great fortune, preserving texts that would otherwise have vanished forever beneath Mesopotamia's shifting sands. The library contained approximately 15,000 cuneiform tablets, representing the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization. Among these treasures lay 12 tablets containing what would become known as the standard Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, though Smith and his contemporaries did not immediately recognize them as parts of a single, cohesive narrative. The tablets had been broken, scattered, mixed with fragments from other texts, and covered with millennia of accumulated dirt. Piecing them together required painstaking work, sharp eyes, linguistic expertise, and considerable luck. When Smith finally assembled enough fragments to recognize the flood story, his excitement reportedly overcame his normally reserved demeanor. Colleagues in the reading room later recalled how he began removing articles of clothing and running around the room, shouting in delight at his discovery. His presentation to the Society of Biblical Archaeology on December 3, 1872, drew an audience that included Prime Minister William Gladstone himself. The response was immediate and electric. Here was proof that the biblical flood narrative had roots reaching far deeper into human history than anyone had imagined. The Daily Telegraph newspaper, recognizing both the scholarly significance and popular appeal of Smith's work, sponsored an expedition to return to Nineveh in search of missing fragments. In January 1873, Smith embarked on his first journey to Mesopotamia. Despite having no previous travel experience beyond occasional research trips to Paris, no knowledge of Arabic, Turkish or Persian, and no real preparation for the rigours of Middle Eastern archaeological work. Yet his determination and skill proved equal to the challenge. Remarkably, on just the 5th day of excavation at Nineveh, Smith discovered a fragment that helped complete the flood account. The story Smith gradually reconstructed from these ancient tablets told of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, a powerful city-state in southern Mesopotamia. This king, described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 mortal, embarked on an extraordinary quest for immortality after the death of his beloved friend Enkidu. His journey took him beyond the known world to meet Utnapishtim, the sole human survivor of a catastrophic flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. Utnapishtim's story within Gilgamesh's story provided the parallel to Genesis that had so excited Smith's Victorian audience. But the Epic of Gilgamesh contained far more than a flood narrative. The complete text, as scholars gradually assembled it over subsequent decades, revealed a sophisticated literary work exploring profound philosophical and existential questions through the vehicle of adventure narrative. The epic traced Gilgamesh's transformation from a tyrannical, self-absorbed ruler into a wise king who understood his place in the human condition. Through friendship, loss, quest, and ultimate acceptance of mortality, the ancient hero underwent a journey that resonated across cultures and centuries. The tablets Smith studied represented one stage in the epic's long textual evolution. The standard Babylonian version he helped reconstruct had been compiled by a scholar-priest named Sinleki-Unnini sometime between the 13th and 10th centuries BCE. This version drew upon earlier traditions, including independent Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh that dated back to approximately 2100 BCE, during what scholars call the Third Dynasty of Ur. These earlier poems had circulated as separate stories rather than forming parts of a unified narrative. Sinleki-Unnini's achievement lay in weaving these disparate tales into a coherent epic with thematic unity and philosophical depth. Before Sinleki-Unnini, an earlier compilation known as the Old Babylonian version had existed, dating to the 18th century BCE. This version bore the title Surpassing All Other Kings, taken from its opening line. Only fragments of this version have survived, but they demonstrate that the tradition of Gilgamesh narratives was already well established by this period. The standard Babylonian version changed the opening to He Who Saw the Deep, emphasizing wisdom and understanding rather than mere power and accomplishment. The transformation from oral tradition to written text, from independent stories to unified epic, from Sumerian to Akkadian language, from Old Babylonian to Standard Babylonian version, represents a process spanning nearly 1,000 years. Throughout this evolution, the core elements remained remarkably consistent, suggesting both the power of the original narratives and the care with which successive generations of scribes and scholars preserved and transmitted them. Each version added layers of meaning, refined the characterization, and deepened the philosophical dimensions of the story. Understanding the Epic of Gilgamesh requires situating it within the rich cultural context of ancient Mesopotamia. The world that produced this epic was one of the earliest and most sophisticated civilizations in human history. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in a region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning the land between the rivers, human communities had transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherer existence to settled agricultural civilization by the 4th millennium BCE. This transformation created surplus resources, specialized labor, complex social hierarchies, and the earliest forms of writing. The Sumerians, whose language forms the oldest layer of the Gilgamesh tradition, developed one of the first writing systems around 3000 BCE. Initially created for accounting and administrative purposes, cuneiform writing gradually expanded to record laws, religious texts, poetry, and eventually literary works like the Gilgamesh narratives. The script itself consisted of wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay tablets using reed styluses. Once dried or baked, these tablets became remarkably durable, capable of surviving for millennia under the right conditions. The city of Uruk, Gilgamesh's legendary capital, stood among the most important urban centres of ancient Sumer. Archaeological evidence suggests Uruk reached its peak between approximately 4100 and 2900 BCE, though it remained culturally and religiously significant for centuries afterward. At its height, Uruk may have housed as many as 50,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. The city featured impressive architecture, including massive temples dedicated to the gods Anu and Inanna, and was surrounded by formidable walls that later tradition attributed to Gilgamesh himself. The Sumerian civilization that produced the earliest Gilgamesh stories operated under a unique political and religious system. City-states like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kish functioned as independent political entities, each ruled by a priest-king who served as both secular and religious leader. These rulers claimed divine sanction for their authority, and often traced their lineage to the gods themselves. The relationship between human and divine realms remained fluid and immediate in Sumerian thought. Gods intervened regularly in human affairs, while exceptional humans could achieve divine status after death. This religious worldview permeates the Epic of Gilgamesh. The hero himself embodies the boundary between human and divine, being two-thirds god through his mother Ninsun, a goddess, while remaining one-third mortal through his father Lugalbanda, a priest-king. This mixed nature creates the central tension driving the narrative. Gilgamesh possesses godlike power and accomplishment but cannot escape human mortality. His quest for immortality represents the human desire to transcend natural limits, while his ultimate acceptance of death marks his achievement of wisdom. The Sumerian pantheon featured hundreds of deities governing every aspect of natural and social life. At the top stood Anu, the sky god and father of the gods. His daughter Inanna, later identified with the Akkadian goddess Ishtar, held dominion over love, fertility, and warfare, an association that might seem strange to modern sensibilities, but reflected ancient understanding of these forces' unpredictable, passionate, and potentially destructive nature. Enlil governed wind and storms and played a crucial role in maintaining cosmic order. Enki, or Ea in Akkadian, served as the god of wisdom, crafts, and fresh water. These and other divine beings appear throughout the Gilgamesh epic, shaping events and revealing the complex relationship ancient Mesopotamians envisioned between human and supernatural realms. The third dynasty of Ur, the period when scholars believe the earliest written Gilgamesh poems were composed, represented a renaissance of Sumerian culture following a period of foreign domination. Around 2112 BCE, Utu-Hagal, ruler of Uruk, led a successful revolt against the Gutians, who had controlled the region since approximately 2218 BCE. Utu-Hagal's successor, Ur-Nammu, founded the third dynasty centered at the city of Ur and established control over much of southern Mesopotamia. This period witnessed remarkable achievements in literature, art, architecture, and law. King Shulgi, who ruled during the height of the third dynasty from approximately 2029 to 1982 BCE, took particular interest in literary culture. He established academies for the study and recording of ancient stories and traditions. Shulgi claimed Gilgamesh as his brother, asserting that both shared the same divine parents, Lugalbanda and Ninsun. This claim served obvious political purposes, connecting Shulgi's legitimacy to legendary past glory. But it also demonstrates how deeply the figure of Gilgamesh had become embedded in Mesopotamian cultural consciousness by this period. The historical king who may have ruled Uruk around 2600 BCE had been transformed into a legendary hero, whose exploits provided models for later rulers to emulate. The question of whether a historical Gilgamesh actually existed has long fascinated scholars. Unlike many legendary heroes, Gilgamesh appears in what ancient Mesopotamians considered historical documents. The Sumerian king list, a text recording the succession of kings from antediluvian times through various dynasties, includes Gilgamesh as the 5th king of Uruk's first dynasty. The list credits him with ruling for 126 years, an obviously legendary number, but one that suggests he was remembered as having reigned for an unusually long time. Other texts credit him with building Uruk's Great Walls, a project that would have required enormous resources and labour. Archaeological discoveries have lent some credibility to these traditions. The discovery of artefacts associated with Enmebaragesi of Kish, a king mentioned in the legends as contemporary with Gilgamesh, suggests that at least some figures in these early king lists were historical, rather than purely mythological. Furthermore, an inscription found at Uruk mentions someone who might be Gilgamesh, though the damaged text makes certain identification impossible. Most scholars today accept that a historical king named Gilgamesh probably ruled Uruk sometime during the early dynastic period, roughly between 2900 and 2350 BCE, though the legendary figure evolved far beyond whatever historical reality might have existed. The process by which historical figures become legendary heroes follows recognizable patterns across cultures. Exceptional rulers who presided over periods of prosperity, military success, or significant construction projects become subjects of increasingly elaborate stories as oral tradition elaborates their achievements over generations. Details grow more fantastic, divine elements accumulate, and the historical figure gradually transforms into an archetypal hero, embodying cultural ideals and anxieties. This process certainly occurred with Gilgamesh, whose transformation from Sumerian king to immortal hero took place over many centuries. By the time of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, Gilgamesh had become a deity in his own right, worshipped in temples throughout Mesopotamia. God lists from this period include his name, and prayers addressed to him as a judge of the dead in the underworld have been preserved. This deification represented the ultimate honour ancient Mesopotamian culture could bestow, recognizing an individual's achievement as transcending normal human limitations. Yet even as a god, Gilgamesh remained fundamentally associated with human concerns, particularly the question of mortality and the search for meaning in a finite existence. The 5 independent Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh that survive from the 3rd dynasty of Ur period provide our earliest literary glimpses of the hero. These poems, while related to later versions of the epic, stand as separate narratives with distinct plots and emphases. Understanding these early texts helps illuminate how the tradition evolved and which elements remained constant across different versions and time periods. The poem, typically called Gilgamesh and Huwawa, or Gilgamesh and the Land of the Living, recounts the hero's journey to the cedar forest to confront the monster Huwawa, guardian of the forest and servant of the god Enlil. In this version, Gilgamesh's motivation stems partly from a desire for fame and glory, but also from an explicit confrontation with mortality. Realizing that humans die while only great deeds endure, he resolves to establish his name through heroic action. His servant Enkidu, here clearly subordinate to the king rather than his equal, accompanies him on the journey. Together they defeat Huwawa, though the ending remains unclear in the damaged text. This Sumerian poem introduces themes that would remain central to later versions: the quest for lasting fame as a response to mortality, the importance of loyal companionship, the conflict between human ambition and divine authority, and the transformative power of adventure beyond civilization's boundaries. However, significant differences exist between this early version and the later standard Babylonian account. In the Sumerian poem, the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu seems more hierarchical, and the emotional dimensions of their bond receive less emphasis. The encounter with Huwawa also lacks some of the moral complexity found in later versions, where killing the guardian of the sacred forest carries more ambiguous ethical implications. Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven presents another adventure, though this time the action occurs in Uruk rather than distant lands. In this poem, the goddess Inanna proposes marriage to Gilgamesh, but he rejects her advances, recounting the unfortunate fates of her previous lovers. Enraged by this insult, Inanna persuades her father Anu to unleash the Bull of Heaven against Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu together defeat the monstrous bull, but their victory brings divine punishment. The poem explores themes of hybris, divine retribution, the dangers of rejecting proper relationships with the gods, and the solidarity between hero and companion in the face of supernatural threats. The relationship between this Sumerian poem and the corresponding episode in the standard Babylonian version demonstrates how the tradition evolved. Later versions gave much greater weight to Gilgamesh's reasons for rejecting the goddess, transforming what might initially have been simple hybris into a more complex meditation on the destructive aspects of divine passion. The death of the bull of heaven also gains greater significance in later versions as one of the actions that brings about Enkidu's death, connecting disparate episodes into a more unified narrative structure. Gilgamesh and Agga of Kish presents a completely different story, one not included in later versions of the epic at all. This poem recounts a political conflict between Gilgamesh and Agga, king of the rival city-state Kish. When Agga besieges Uruk, Gilgamesh must decide whether to submit or fight. He consults both an assembly of elders and an assembly of young men, receiving different counsel from each group. Ultimately choosing war, Gilgamesh defeats Agga's forces through a combination of military prowess and diplomatic skill. The poem provides a rare glimpse of Gilgamesh as a political and military leader rather than a questing hero, suggesting that even in early traditions the figure encompassed multiple dimensions. The most significant Sumerian poem for understanding later developments is Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld, also called Gilgamesh and the Hulupu Tree. This text narrates how the goddess Inanna plants a hulupu tree in her garden, intending to craft a throne and bed from its wood once it matures. However, 3 creatures take up residence in the tree: a serpent at its roots, an Anzu bird in its branches, and the demon Lilith in its trunk. Unable to drive them away herself, Inanna seeks help from Gilgamesh, who kills the serpent and drives off the other creatures. From the tree's wood, Inanna makes objects called puku and miku, the exact nature of which remains unclear. These objects somehow fall into the underworld, and when Enkidu volunteers to retrieve them, he becomes trapped in the realm of the dead. The second part of this Sumerian poem served as the basis for Tablet 12 of the standard Babylonian epic, though that tablet stands somewhat apart from the main narrative and may have been added later. In both versions, Gilgamesh manages to bring Enkidu's spirit back from the underworld temporarily, and Enkidu describes the conditions of the dead, providing ancient Mesopotamian views about the afterlife. The image of the underworld presented in these texts paints a grim picture, a dark, dusty realm where the dead exist as pale shadows of their former selves, their condition in death determined largely by how they died, and whether proper burial rites were performed. A fifth Sumerian poem, The Death of Gilgamesh, exists only in very fragmentary form, making its reconstruction uncertain. What survives suggests it dealt with Gilgamesh's own death and passage to the underworld, where he receives offerings from the living and exercises some authority among the dead. This poem's existence demonstrates that even the earliest Gilgamesh traditions recognize that the hero's story must ultimately end in death. Despite his supernatural birth and extraordinary achievements, the tension between Gilgamesh's godlike qualities and his human mortality forms the thematic core of all versions of the epic. These Sumerian poems circulated independently rather than as chapters in a unified epic. Each stood as a complete narrative with its own structure, themes, and purposes. Scribes copied them in cuneiform on clay tablets for use in temple libraries and scribal schools, where they served educational functions teaching both literacy and cultural values. The poem's preservation owes much to their use in this educational context. Apprentice scribes learned cuneiform by copying important texts, and the Gilgamesh poems apparently ranked among the favourites, deemed worthy of transmission to new generations. The transition from these independent Sumerian poems to the unified Akkadian epic represents one of the most significant developments in literary history. This transformation occurred during what scholars call the Old Babylonian period, roughly the 18th century BCE. By this time, political conditions in Mesopotamia had shifted dramatically. The Sumerian language, though preserved in religious and literary contexts, had ceased to be spoken in daily life, replaced by Akkadian, a Semitic language unrelated to Sumerian. The Old Babylonian kingdom, centered at the city of Babylon, had become the dominant power in Mesopotamia under the famous lawgiver Hammurabi and his successors. The Old Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic, unfortunately known only through fragments, bore the title Surpassing All Other Kings, emphasizing the hero's superiority over other rulers in strength, accomplishment, and glory. This version represented something genuinely new in world literature, an attempt to create a unified, coherent narrative from previously independent stories about a legendary figure. The compiler, whose name has not survived, selected episodes from the Sumerian tradition, translated them into Akkadian, added new material, and wove everything together into a structured whole with thematic continuity. The fragments that survive from the Old Babylonian version demonstrate both continuity with and development beyond the Sumerian poems. The character of Enkidu undergoes significant evolution. Rather than appearing as Gilgamesh's servant from the beginning, Enkidu in the Old Babylonian version begins as a wild man living among animals in the wilderness. His transformation from wild to civilized, his meeting with Gilgamesh as an equal, and their subsequent friendship form major narrative threads. This transformation of their relationship from hierarchical to fraternal represents a crucial development, elevating the emotional and philosophical dimensions of the story. The Old Babylonian version also shows the beginning of the epic's focus on mortality and the quest for meaning in human existence. While the Sumerian poems touched on these themes, particularly in Gilgamesh and the Land of the Living, the unified structure of the Old Babylonian epic allowed for more sustained exploration of these existential questions. The death of Enkidu, which apparently occurred roughly midway through the narrative, served as a pivotal moment that transformed Gilgamesh's character and motivated his subsequent quest. The cultural context of Old Babylonian Mesopotamia influenced how the epic was shaped. This period witnessed significant urbanization, the development of complex legal codes like Hammurabi's famous law collection, and increased attention to questions of justice, order, and the proper relationship between rulers and ruled. The Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly in its portrayal of Gilgamesh's transformation from tyrannical to wise king, reflected these concerns. The story became, among other things, a meditation on kingship and the qualities necessary for just rule. Only a few tablets from the Old Babylonian version have survived, and these exist in fragmentary condition, making complete reconstruction impossible. Nevertheless, scholars have been able to determine that this version contained many of the episodes familiar from later texts. Enkidu's creation and civilization, his meeting with Gilgamesh, their journey to the cedar forest, the death of Humbaba, Ishtar's proposal and the bull of heaven, Enkidu's death, and Gilgamesh's subsequent quest. The specific details, emphases, and some plot elements differed from the later standard Babylonian version, but the overall narrative arc had clearly taken shape. The standard Babylonian version, compiled by the scholar priest Sinleku-Nini sometime between the 13th and 10th centuries BCE, represents the most complete and sophisticated version of the epic. This is the version George Smith gradually reconstructed from the tablets in Ashurbanipal's library, and it remains the basis for most modern translations and interpretations. Sinleku-Nini's achievement involved not merely copying earlier texts, but rather creating what might be called a critical edition, drawing on multiple sources, resolving inconsistencies, adding new material, and shaping the narrative to emphasize particular themes. The standard Babylonian version changed the epic's opening line to "He who saw the deep," immediately establishing a different emphasis than "surpassing all other kings." The new title stressed wisdom, understanding, and perception rather than power and glory. This shift reflected Sinleku-Nini's interpretive priorities. While the epic certainly continued to celebrate Gilgamesh's extraordinary achievements, the standard Babylonian version placed greater weight on his spiritual and intellectual journey, his gradual acquisition of wisdom through suffering, and his ultimate acceptance of human limitations. Sinleku-Nini organized the epic into 12 tablets, creating a structure that allowed for careful pacing and thematic development. The first tablet introduces Gilgamesh in his glory and his tyranny, establishes the god's decision to create Enkidu as a counterbalance, and narrates Enkidu's transformation from wild to civilized. Tablets 2 through 5 cover the friendship between the heroes and their journey to confront Humbaba. Tablet 6 presents Ishtar's proposal and the Bull of Heaven. Tablet 7 describes Enkidu's illness and death. Tablet 8 narrates Gilgamesh's grief and the funeral rites. Tablets 9 and 10 follow Gilgamesh's journey in search of Utnapishtim. Tablet 11 contains Utnapishtim's flood story and Gilgamesh's failed test for immortality. The 12th tablet, adapted from the Sumerian Gilgamesh Enkidu and the Netherworld, stands somewhat apart and may have been appended later. This structure reveals Sinlekyunini's literary sophistication. The epic divides roughly into two halves, with Enkidu's death marking the pivot point. The first half focuses on friendship, adventure, and the exercise of extraordinary power. The second half turns inward, exploring grief, mortality, and the search for meaning. This structure creates a powerful emotional and philosophical arc, taking the hero and the audience through a complete journey of transformation. The standard Babylonian version also shows Sinlekyunini's skill in using parallel scenes and recurring motifs to create thematic unity. Dreams play a crucial role throughout the epic, serving as vehicles for divine communication and foreshadowing future events. Gates and doorways mark transitions between different states of being. Water imagery recurs in various forms, from the cleansing that marks Enkidu's entrance into civilization to the waters of death that must be crossed to reach Utnapishtim. These and other repeated elements bind the narrative together while allowing for subtle variations that reveal character development. The language of the standard Babylonian version demonstrates considerable poetic sophistication, while translation inevitably loses much of the original's verbal texture. Scholars who can read the Akkadian cuneiform text report remarkable imagery, wordplay, and emotional power. The epic employs formulaic repetitions common in oral poetry, but these repetitions serve dramatic purposes, emphasizing key moments and allowing for significant variations that reveal changing circumstances or developing insights. The story itself, as preserved in Sinlekyunini's standard Babylonian version, begins with a prologue inviting the audience to hear of Gilgamesh's extraordinary journey. The narrator describes the great walls of Uruk, traditionally attributed to Gilgamesh's building program, and directs attention to a tablet of lapis lazuli hidden within the wall's foundation, supposedly inscribed by Gilgamesh himself with the account of his adventures. This framing device creates interesting narrative levels. The audience hears Gilgamesh's own voice, transmitted through millennia, speaking of experiences that transformed him from a mighty but flawed ruler into a wise king who understood the human condition. The opening description of Gilgamesh emphasizes his exceptional nature. He stands two-thirds divine through his mother Ninsun, a goddess known as Lady Wild Cow, and one-third human through his father Lugalbanda, a king who after death also received divine honors. This unusual ratio, impossible in practical terms, symbolizes Gilgamesh's position between divine and human realms. He possesses godlike strength, beauty, and intelligence, but remains ultimately subject to human mortality. This fundamental tension drives the entire narrative. Physical descriptions emphasize Gilgamesh's overwhelming presence. He stands taller than other men, stronger than any warrior, and more beautiful than anyone in Uruk. His vigor seems inexhaustible, his appetites enormous. Yet these gifts become sources of oppression for his people. The epic states that Gilgamesh leaves no son to his father and no bride to her groom, suggesting he exhausts the young men in constant athletic competitions and exercises droit du seigneur, claiming the right to sleep with every bride on her wedding night. His behavior represents an abuse of power stemming from his exceptional qualities rather than malice. He simply cannot comprehend limits that would restrain an ordinary human. The citizens of Uruk, unable to resist their superhuman king, cry out to the gods for relief. Their prayers reach the heavens, and the gods convene to address the problem. Anu, father of the gods, recognizes that Gilgamesh requires someone capable of challenging him, someone who can serve as an equal rather than a subordinate. He commands Aruru, the goddess who shapes humanity from clay, to create such a being. Aruru conceives of Enkidu, fashioning him from clay mixed with saliva, creating a wild man to balance the civilized king. Enkidu emerges as Gilgamesh's opposite in almost every particular. Where Gilgamesh lives at civilization's center, Enkidu dwells in the wilderness. Where Gilgamesh wears fine garments and jewels, Enkidu's body is covered with thick hair. Where Gilgamesh feasts on bread and beer, the products of agricultural civilization, Enkidu grazes on grass with the gazelles and drinks at waterholes with wild animals. Where Gilgamesh represents humanity's capacity for culture, technology, and social organization, Enkidu embodies humanity's kinship with nature and animal existence. Yet Enkidu proves more than merely savage. The text emphasizes that while he lives among animals and shares their habits, he also helps them, freeing creatures caught in hunters' traps and filling in pits dug to capture game. This protective role suggests that Enkidu possesses a moral sense and capacity for compassion even in his wild state. His actions disrupt human hunting activities, bringing him to the attention of a trapper whose livelihood depends on capturing animals. The trapper, frightened by Enkidu's enormous strength and strange behavior, seeks advice from his father about how to deal with this wild man who has ruined his traps. The father suggests a plan that reveals much about ancient Mesopotamian views on sexuality and civilization. He advises his son to visit Gilgamesh and request a temple prostitute named Shamhat, a servant of Ishtar whose sexual services form part of religious rituals. Shamhat should accompany the trapper to the watering hole where Enkidu comes with the animals. When Enkidu arrives, Shamhat should disrobe and seduce him. The father predicts that after Enkidu experiences sexual intimacy with a civilized woman, the wild animals will reject him, and he will be forced to enter human society. This plan reveals the ancient Mesopotamian understanding of sexuality as a transformative threshold between animal nature and human civilization. Sexual experience, particularly with a representative of urban religious culture, marks the transition from innocent animal existence to self-aware human consciousness. The loss of Enkidu's harmony with nature parallels the biblical expulsion from Eden, suggesting that both narratives draw on common ancient Near Eastern traditions about humanity's separation from pristine natural existence. Shamhat arrives at the watering hole and waits for 3 days until Enkidu appears with his animal companions. When the wild man comes to drink, Shamhat opens her garments and exposes her body. Enkidu, who has never seen a human woman, approaches with curiosity rather than caution. For 6 days and 7 nights, they engage in continuous lovemaking, an epic consummation that transforms Enkidu fundamentally. When he finally rises and tries to return to his animal companions, they flee from him. The gazelles sense that he is changed, that he no longer belongs to their world. Enkidu tries to run after them but discovers his legs have grown weak, his body no longer adapted for wild existence. The physical changes symbolize deeper transformations. Enkidu's consciousness has expanded. He now possesses knowledge, understanding, and awareness that separate him irrevocably from animal innocence. The text states that Enkidu has become wise, that his understanding has broadened. He returns to Shamhat, who recognizes in his face that he now resembles a god rather than an animal. She tells him he has become beautiful and praises his new wisdom. Then she speaks words that will shape his destiny, asking why he should continue running with wild animals when he could enter Uruk and meet Gilgamesh, who surpasses all men in strength and vigor. Shamhat describes Gilgamesh in terms that intrigue Enkidu. She mentions that Gilgamesh has been having dreams about him, that the king has already been told by his mother that a mighty companion would come to him. This detail suggests divine orchestration of events. The gods, having created Enkidu specifically to balance Gilgamesh, have also prepared the king psychologically for their meeting through prophetic dreams. The narrative weaves together themes of fate, divine intervention, and personal choice in ways that acknowledge both supernatural influence and human agency. Enkidu agrees to go to Uruk, declaring that he will challenge Gilgamesh and demonstrate his own strength. His motivation contains elements of pride and competitiveness, but also a desire for companionship and purpose. The wild man who freed animals from traps now seeks a worthy opponent, someone who can match his own power. Shamat promises to lead him to Uruk, but first takes him to a shepherd's camp, an intermediate stage between wilderness and city. This episode demonstrates ancient Mesopotamian understanding of civilization as a gradual process rather than a single moment of transformation. At the shepherd's camp, Enkidu encounters products of human culture for the first time. The shepherds place bread before him, but he does not know what to do with it, having never eaten anything but the plants he grazed with the gazelles. Similarly, they offer him beer, but he stares at it in confusion. Shamat must teach him how to consume these basic elements of civilized life. After initial reluctance, Enkidu eats the bread and drinks the beer, consuming 7 jugs until he becomes drunk and his heart grows light. In his intoxication, he sings and makes merry. The shepherds then bathe him, anoint him with oil, and clothe him in garments, completing his external transformation into a civilized man. This sequence carries deep symbolic significance. Bread and beer, produced through agriculture and fermentation technologies, represent human mastery over nature through cultivation and transformation of raw materials. By consuming these products, Enkidu participates in the human project of imposing order and meaning on natural existence. The bathing and anointing mirror religious purification rituals, while the clothing marks his acceptance of social conventions that distinguish humans from animals. Yet the detail about intoxication suggests ambivalence about this transformation. Civilization brings not only bread and culture but also altered consciousness, artificiality, and departure from natural existence. At the shepherd's camp, Enkidu also takes on the role of protector, defending the sheep from lions and wolves that attack at night. This activity parallels his earlier protection of wild animals from hunters' traps, but reverses the alignment. Now he guards domesticated animals against wild predators rather than helping wild creatures against human hunters. The reversal marks his transition from the wilderness side to the civilization side of the boundary, though his enormous strength remains constant across this transformation. He has become a civilized warrior rather than a wild protector of nature. News reaches the camp that Gilgamesh plans to exercise his royal prerogative with a bride that very night. Enkidu, despite his recent entrance into civilization, immediately recognizes this behavior as wrong. His moral sense, present even in his wild state when he freed trapped animals, now expresses itself through civilized concepts of justice and proper conduct. He declares he will confront Gilgamesh and challenge his abusive behavior. Shamat and Enkidu proceed to Uruk, where citizens gather to marvel at the newcomer who resembles Gilgamesh in stature and strength, though his hair grows as thick as fields of barley. The meeting between Gilgamesh and Enkidu occurs at the threshold of the house where the wedding is to take place. As Gilgamesh approaches to claim his rights over the bride, Enkidu blocks the doorway, refusing to let the king pass. Threshold spaces hold special significance throughout the epic, marking boundaries between different states of being. Here the threshold becomes the site of confrontation between civilization's might and nature's strength, between established authority and moral challenge, between solitary power and the beginning of companionship. The two heroes wrestle in the street with such violence that doorposts shake and walls shudder. The combat is described in terms that emphasize both its ferocity and its equality. Neither can gain decisive advantage. They match each other in strength, determination, and skill. The fight represents more than a simple contest of force. It serves as a test through which each recognizes the other's worth. Gilgamesh, accustomed to overwhelming all opposition, finally encounters someone who can stand against him. Enkidu, seeking a worthy outlet for his enormous strength, finds an equal who can push him to his limits. The resolution of the fight reveals character depths that transcend mere physical contest. Accounts differ slightly in various versions, but the standard Babylonian text suggests that Gilgamesh eventually gains a slight advantage, perhaps forcing Enkidu to one knee. At this moment, with victory within reach, something unexpected happens. Enkidu acknowledges Gilgamesh's supremacy, not because he has been completely defeated, but because he recognizes in Gilgamesh something beyond mere strength. The wild man sees nobility, unique destiny, and divine favor that set Gilgamesh apart. His anger transforms into respect and affection. Gilgamesh responds with equal generosity. Rather than pressing his advantage or punishing the challenger, he embraces Enkidu. The text describes them kissing and becoming friends, a bond that ancient Mesopotamian literature understood as capable of depths exceeding even family relationships. The two heroes, created to balance each other, discover that balance does not require opposition but rather complementarity. Gilgamesh gains a companion who can share adventures impossible for ordinary humans. Enkidu gains purpose and belonging that his wild existence had lacked despite its freedom. Together they form something greater than either could achieve alone. Gilgamesh brings Enkidu before his mother, the goddess Ninsun, who resides in her sacred chamber within Uruk's temple complex. Ninsun, wise in divine knowledge, immediately understands the significance of this friendship. She adopts Enkidu as her own son, making him Gilgamesh's brother in the eyes of gods and men. This formal recognition elevates their bond from simple friendship to sacred kinship, with all the obligations and intimacy that relationship entails. The two heroes are now bound by ties approaching those between twins, sharing destiny as well as affection. The friendship transforms both heroes, but particularly Gilgamesh. The king who had oppressed his people through excessive vigor and disregard for others now channels his energy toward worthy goals. Rather than exhausting young men in pointless contests or violating brides, he turns his attention outward, seeking challenges beyond Uruk's walls. The companionship provides what Gilgamesh's godlike power had lacked: someone to temper his excesses, share his burdens, and mirror his glory. For perhaps the first time, Gilgamesh experiences genuine intimacy, seeing himself reflected in someone else's eyes. After some time has passed and their friendship has deepened, Gilgamesh proposes an expedition that will test their combined might and establish their fame. He suggests they journey to the cedar forest, the sacred grove overseen by the fearsome guardian Humbaba, whom the god Enlil appointed to protect the forest and terrorize humans who might approach. Gilgamesh's stated motivation combines several elements. He desires to establish an eternal name through heroic deeds. He wants to cut down the sacred cedars, both for their valuable wood and to demonstrate human power over nature. He seeks glory that will transcend his mortal existence, achieving through fame what he cannot achieve through immortality. Enkidu responds with immediate alarm and opposition to this plan. Unlike Gilgamesh, who has lived his entire life in the city, Enkidu knows the wilderness and its dangers. He has roamed the region where the cedar forest lies. He has seen Humbaba and knows the guardian's terrifying nature. Humbaba's roar, Enkidu warns, sounds like the storm flood. His breath spews fire. His jaws are death itself. The monster guards the forest for the god Enlil, who will be enraged if they kill his servant. Enkidu's objections reveal his greater wisdom about nature's power and the dangers of offending the gods. Civilization has not erased his wild knowledge, but rather combined it with new understanding, making him more cognizant than Gilgamesh of the risks they would face. Gilgamesh dismisses these warnings with the confidence of someone who has never truly failed. He argues that all humans must die eventually, so fear of death should not prevent them from seeking glory. Better to die attempting great deeds than to live in comfortable mediocrity. His words carry the tragic irony that permeates the entire epic. Gilgamesh speaks bravely about accepting mortality, yet his deepest fear is precisely death's inevitability. He proposes the expedition partly to distract himself from existential anxieties that his godlike power cannot resolve. The quest for eternal fame represents an attempt to transcend death symbolically, if not literally. The two friends prepare for the journey by commissioning weapons from the finest craftsmen in Uruk. The blacksmiths forge enormous axes and swords weighing hundreds of pounds each, weapons that only heroes of supernatural strength could wield. These preparations are described in detail, emphasizing both the expedition's seriousness and the hero's exceptional nature. The weapons become extensions of their wielder's power, physical manifestations of will and strength directed toward a goal that will define their relationship and transform Gilgamesh's character. Before departing, Gilgamesh must seek counsel and blessing from the elders of Uruk and from his mother Ninsun. The elders, reflecting conventional wisdom and caution, advise against the expedition. They repeat Enkidu's warnings about Humbaba's terrible power and suggest that Gilgamesh should content himself with the responsibilities and pleasures of kingship rather than risking his life in distant wilderness. Their council represents society's conservative impulse to preserve existing order and avoid dangerous innovation. Gilgamesh listens respectfully but remains unmoved, his will fixed on the goal he has chosen. Ninsun's response demonstrates more complexity. As a goddess and Gilgamesh's mother, she possesses supernatural knowledge but also maternal concern. She performs elaborate rituals, adorning herself in ceremonial garments and offering incense to the sun god Shamash, who governs justice and long journeys. Her prayer acknowledges that Shamash has somehow stirred this restlessness in Gilgamesh's heart, implying divine agency behind the hero's desires. She asks Shamash to protect her son during the expedition, and then, in a remarkable gesture, formally adopts Enkidu and charges him with Gilgamesh's safety. The scene reveals the gods' awareness of coming events and their manipulation of circumstances toward purposes not yet clear to the human participants. The journey to the cedar forest takes many days, compressed in the narrative through formulaic repetitions that mark the passage of time while maintaining dramatic momentum. Each evening Gilgamesh and Enkidu halt their march, dig a well to obtain water, and pour ritual offerings to the gods. Gilgamesh then ascends a mountain and prays for favorable dreams. This sequence repeats multiple times, with Gilgamesh experiencing increasingly disturbing visions during the night. He dreams of mountains falling on him, of being seized by a creature with lion's paws and eagle's talons, of terrifying transformations and near-death experiences. Each morning Enkidu interprets these frightening dreams in favorable terms, assuring Gilgamesh that the visions actually predict success. The falling mountain represents Humbaba's defeat. The monstrous creature symbolizes their victory over chaos. The terrifying transformations indicate divine favor. These interpretations may reflect Enkidu's desire to encourage his friend, or they may represent genuine insight into dream symbolism. Ancient Mesopotamians understood dreams as messages from the divine realm, but interpreting them required skill and wisdom. The ambiguity leaves readers uncertain whether the friends march toward triumph or disaster. When they finally approach the cedar forest, its magnificence overwhelms them. The trees tower higher than any they have seen, their crowns reaching toward the heavens. The forest stretches in all directions, dense and sacred, forbidden to ordinary humans. The path to the forest's heart is guarded not only by Humbaba, but by magical barriers and supernatural terrors. Yet the heroes have come too far to turn back. They enter the forest, their massive weapons ready, their courage sustained by companionship and the conviction that fame justifies any risk. Deep within the forest, they confront Humbaba at last. The Guardian appears as a monstrous figure, his face terrible beyond description. Different versions of the epic provide varying details about his appearance, but all agree on his overwhelming frightfulness. Humbaba possesses 7 auras or radiances that Enlil granted him, each conferring different terrible powers. His voice alone can paralyze with fear. His breath spreads pestilence and death. He has guarded the forest for generations, preventing humans from despoiling the sacred cedars. The confrontation begins with words rather than weapons. Humbaba recognizes Gilgamesh and mocks him, questioning why the king of Uruk has come so far to challenge a guardian appointed by Enlil himself. Gilgamesh responds with a declaration of their intention to cut down cedars and establish eternal fame. The exchange reveals the conflict's deeper dimensions beyond simple combat between heroes and monster. Humbaba represents the natural order, the divine prohibition against human presumption, the boundary between mortal and sacred realms. Gilgamesh represents human ambition, the desire to transcend limitations, the refusal to accept boundaries. The battle itself unfolds with cosmic intensity. The earth shakes as these superhuman forces clash. Mountains tremble and valleys echo with the sound of combat. Humbaba unleashes his 7 auras, but Gilgamesh and Enkidu fight together, their combined strength matching the Guardian's power. The sun god Shamash intervenes, sending winds to assist the heroes by blinding Humbaba and preventing him from fully deploying his terrible abilities. This divine assistance suggests that the gods have sanctioned the expedition, or at least that not all gods support Enlil's prohibition against human access to the forest. As the battle turns against him, Humbaba pleads for mercy. He addresses Gilgamesh as a king should understand another's defeated position, and offers to serve him, becoming the guardian of cedars on Gilgamesh's behalf rather than Enlil's. This plea introduces moral complexity into what might otherwise be simple heroic adventure. Humbaba becomes more than a monster to be slain. He becomes a conscious being asking for life, offering service, appealing to mercy and practical benefit rather than meaningless destruction. For a moment, Gilgamesh hesitates, moved by these appeals. This hesitation reveals his capacity for compassion and wisdom that will develop more fully later in the epic. But Enkidu, seeing his friend waver, insists that they must complete their task. He argues that if they spare Humbaba, the guardian will continue to threaten any who approach the forest. Perhaps more tellingly, Enkidu suggests that if they show mercy now, they will be blamed for showing weakness rather than praised for showing nobility. The concern for reputation overcomes the impulse toward mercy. The heroes strike together, severing Humbaba's head. The guardian's death cry echoes across the mountains, heard even in distant Uruk. They have achieved their goal, demonstrating their combined might and establishing fame that will indeed prove eternal. Yet the triumph carries an undertone of tragedy. They have killed a being who served the gods, violated a sacred place, and demonstrated the kind of presumption that ancient thought recognized as hybris, the excessive pride that invites divine punishment. After killing Humbaba, Gilgamesh and Enkidu proceed to cut down the mightiest cedars. They select the straightest, tallest tree in the forest, which served as Humbaba's throne, and fell it to create a massive door for Enlil's temple in the city of Nippur. This act represents an attempt to transform their transgression into an offering, to justify the violation of the sacred forest by dedicating its finest product to the chief god's worship. Whether this gesture will appease Enlil or compound their offence remains uncertain. They then cut down additional trees, binding them into rafts for floating down the Euphrates River back to civilization. The journey home takes them down river, a much easier path than their outward march through wilderness. They return to Uruk as conquering heroes, bearing the head of Humbaba and cedar logs that will beautify their city. The citizens celebrate their achievement, praising their strength and courage. For Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the expedition has proven the power of their friendship and established the fame Gilgamesh sought. They have transcended the normal boundaries of human existence, accomplished what no previous hero had dared attempt. Their triumph seems complete, but divine consequences follow swiftly. The goddess Ishtar, attracted by Gilgamesh's glory and beauty after his return, proposes marriage. She appears before him offering herself as bride, promising that if he accepts she will bestow extraordinary gifts. His chariot will be of gold and lapis lazuli. Kings and princes will bow before him. The earth will yield its increase for his benefit. His herds will thrive beyond measure. Everything he touches will prosper beyond imagining. The goddess of love and fertility offers to share her power with the hero who has demonstrated such exceptional qualities. Gilgamesh's response shocks and offends the goddess. Rather than accepting with gratitude, he rejects her proposal with contemptuous words. He questions what he would gain from marriage to her, pointing out that she is merely a door that admits the wind, a back door that fails to keep out drafts, a palace that crushes the defending warrior, pitch that defiles its bearer, a waterskin that soaks its carrier. After these general insults he becomes more specific, recounting the terrible fates of Ishtar's previous lovers. Each man or god who entered into relationship with her eventually suffered destruction or transformation into something diminished. Gilgamesh catalogues these victims with precise detail. Dumuzi, the shepherd god who was Ishtar's first love, received annual lamentation because his relationship with the goddess led to his death and descent to the underworld. A colourful small bird that caught Ishtar's fancy had its wing broken by her. A lion, perfect in strength, fell into pits because of her. A horse suffered the whip, spur, and halter. A shepherd who served her devotedly was transformed into a wolf and torn by his own dogs. Ishgalanu, her father's gardener, refused her advances and was turned into a frog. The pattern seems clear. Intimacy with Ishtar brings ruin to mortal and immortal alike. This catalogue reveals sophisticated understanding of the goddess's nature. Ishtar represents not merely love but passion in all its forms, including the destructive intensity that can consume what it touches. Her association with both love and warfare reflects ancient recognition that these forces share qualities: overwhelming emotion, disregard for consequences, transformation of the person seized by them, potential for both creation and destruction. Gilgamesh's rejection thus represents a choice for rational control over passionate abandonment, for self-preservation over transcendent experience, for the autonomy of the hero over subordination to divine force. Ishtar responds to this rejection with rage that confirms Gilgamesh's warnings about her dangerous nature. She ascends to the heavens and appears before her father Anu, demanding revenge. She insists that Anu give her the bull of heaven so she can destroy Gilgamesh and Uruk for this insult. When Anu hesitates, pointing out that unleashing the bull of heaven would cause terrible destruction and famine, Ishtar makes an extraordinary threat. She declares that if Anu refuses, she will break down the gates of the underworld, allowing the dead to rise and consume the living until the dead outnumber those who remain alive. This threat demonstrates both Ishtar's formidable power and her willingness to overthrow cosmic order to achieve her will. The possibility that she could actually breach the underworld and release the dead suggests capabilities that rival even Anu's authority as king of the gods. Faced with this threat, Anu reluctantly gives Ishtar the bull of heaven, though he extracts a promise that she has ensured Uruk has stored enough grain to survive the 7 years of famine the bull will cause. Ishtar agrees and descends to earth, leading the monstrous bull toward Uruk. The bull of heaven represents divine wrath manifest in physical form, a force of nature turned against human civilization. When it snorts, cracks open in the earth, and hundreds of young men fall into these chasms. Each snort brings more destruction, more death, more chaos. The bull charges through Uruk's streets, demolishing buildings and scattering citizens. Normal weapons prove useless against this supernatural creature. Only heroes of extraordinary power could hope to face it and survive. Gilgamesh and Enkidu confront the bull of heaven together, demonstrating the complementary nature of their abilities. Enkidu seizes the bull by its tail and horns, immobilizing it long enough for Gilgamesh to strike a fatal blow with his sword, driving the blade into the creature's neck at the place where head joins body. The bull of heaven falls dead in Uruk's streets, defeated by the combined might of the two friends. They have once again overcome a supernatural threat, protected their city, and demonstrated their exceptional status. But their triumph proves even more offensive to divine authority than their defeat of Humbaba. After killing the bull of heaven, Enkidu tears out the creature's right thigh and hurls it in Ishtar's face, mocking the goddess and threatening that she will suffer the same fate as her bull if she comes within his reach. Gilgamesh commands the craftsmen of Uruk to remove the bull's enormous horns, which they coat with lapis lazuli and install in his treasury as trophies. The heroes wash their hands in the Euphrates and ride through Uruk in triumph, while citizens celebrate their achievement. That night, as the celebrations continue and the heroes feast in Gilgamesh's palace, Enkidu experiences a dream that drains all joy from their victory. He dreams of the gods in council, debating the heroes' actions and deciding their fate. Anu speaks of the heroes' crimes. They have killed Humbaba, whom Enlil appointed to guard the sacred forest, and they have killed the bull of heaven. For these offences against divine order, one of them must die. Enlil insists on this punishment. Shamash speaks in their defence, pointing out that the heroes acted with his encouragement and blessing. The gods debate their transgression and the proper response. The dream's outcome terrifies Enkidu. The council decides that Enkidu must die while Gilgamesh will be spared. The logic behind this decision remains somewhat unclear. Perhaps the gods recognize that Gilgamesh, as king of Uruk and son of a goddess, bears special responsibilities that require he survive to fulfill them. Perhaps Enkidu is chosen because he was created specifically to balance Gilgamesh, and once that purpose has been served, the gods see no reason to preserve him. Perhaps Enkidu is blamed for the more egregious offence of throwing the bull's thigh at Ishtar and threatening the goddess directly. Or perhaps the gods simply recognize that killing Enkidu will punish Gilgamesh more severely than his own death would, forcing him to face mortality through the lens of devastating loss. Enkidu awakens from this dream knowing his death approaches. He becomes ill, though whether from disease or divine curse the text does not clarify. His sickness grows worse day by day, and he knows that this will be no ordinary death in battle, but rather a slow diminishment as life drains from his powerful body. The hero who wrestled Gilgamesh to a standstill, who seized the bull of heaven by horns and tail, who helped defeat Humbaba in the sacred forest, now lies weakening on his bed, unable to rise, facing the humiliating death of lingering disease. In his suffering, Enkidu curses the door he made from cedar for Enlil's temple, blaming it for the god's wrath. He wishes he had never seen the cedar forest, never undertaken the expedition that has brought this punishment. More significantly, he curses the trapper who first brought Shamat to civilize him, and curses Shamat herself for transforming him from his innocent wild existence. In Enkidu's pain and fear, the entire trajectory of his life from wilderness to civilization seems like a catastrophic error. He longs for the simplicity and safety of his previous existence, when he grazed with gazelles and knew nothing of cities, heroes, gods, or mortality. Shamash, hearing these curses from the heavens, rebukes Enkidu. The sun god reminds him of everything civilization brought him. Friendship with Gilgamesh, a share in glory and adventure, feasting and fine clothing, and a position of honor beside the greatest king. Without Shamat's intervention, Enkidu would have died unknown in the wilderness, prey eventually to stronger beasts or simple accident, his strength meaningless in isolation. Instead, he has lived intensely and memorably, forming bonds that will outlast physical death. Shamash's words remind Enkidu that his life, however brief, has had meaning that transcends mere survival. Moved by Shamash's wisdom, Enkidu reverses his curses, transforming them into blessings. He prays that Shamat will prosper, that men will favor her, that she will receive rich gifts and be honored by all. This reversal demonstrates Enkidu's growth even in the face of death. He accepts responsibility for his choices and recognizes that his transformation, despite leading to his current suffering, brought genuine goods that he should not reject simply because pain has followed joy. The character who began as an innocent wild man, who was civilized through sexuality, who found brotherhood with a king, now achieves a final wisdom in accepting the full weight of his lived experience. But Enkidu's reconciliation with his past does not bring peace about his future. He experiences a second dream even more terrifying than the first. In this vision, a figure seizes him, a being with dark features, lion's paws and eagle's talons. This creature drags Enkidu toward the underworld, the house of darkness from which none return. Enkidu sees the path all must walk, the journey that ends in dust and shadow. He witnesses the underworld's residents, former kings and priests serving and being served, all diminished to shadows of their living glory. He sees Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, and her scribe recording each new arrival. The vision grants Enkidu knowledge of the fate awaiting him, and, ultimately, all humans. This dream of the underworld provides crucial information about ancient Mesopotamian views on death and the afterlife. The realm of the dead appears as a place of darkness, dust, and diminishment. The dead exist as pale shadows called Gidim, retaining something of consciousness and identity but lacking the vigor and joy of living existence. Their food is clay, their drink is dust. They sit in darkness forever, clothed in feathers like birds. Even the most powerful kings and queens, once they enter this realm, lose their authority and glory. Death, the great equalizer, reduces all to the same shadowy existence. For 12 days, Enkidu lies on his sickbed, growing progressively weaker. Gilgamesh remains beside him constantly, refusing to leave his friend's side. The king who once could not comprehend limitations now faces the most absolute limitation of all. He cannot prevent his friend's death despite all his power and glory. Gilgamesh watches helplessly as the mighty Enkidu, who matched him in strength and courage, dwindles toward nothingness. The friendship that had defined both their lives now reveals its temporal nature. Unable to transcend mortality despite its intensity, on the 12th day, Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh's response demonstrates grief more profound and consuming than perhaps any previously recorded in literature. He touches his friend's body and feels its growing coldness. He places his hand on Enkidu's chest and feels no heartbeat. He covers Enkidu's face like a bride, meaning perhaps that he veils it as one would veil a bride, or that he treats the corpse with the tenderness reserved for a beloved spouse. He circles Enkidu's body like an eagle, back and forth, unable to accept what has happened. He roars like a lioness whose cubs have been taken, giving voice to anguish that transcends words. Gilgamesh tears out his hair and rips off his fine garments, casting aside the external markers of his royal status. The king who had always appeared in majesty now presents himself in mourning that acknowledges no social convention or personal dignity. His grief strips away every pretense, revealing the raw human vulnerability beneath his godlike exterior. For perhaps the first time in his life, Gilgamesh fully experiences powerlessness. All his strength, all his divine heritage, all his achievements mean nothing in the face of death's absolute authority. The funeral rites for Enkidu consume enormous resources. Gilgamesh commands the craftsman to create a statue of his friend in pure gold, a memorial that will preserve his image when flesh has decayed. He orders that artisans, farmers, shepherds, priests and citizens of all ranks should participate in mourning. The entire city grieves for Enkidu, recognizing in his death a loss that affects not just the king but all of Uruk. The wild man who had entered their city to challenge their tyrannical king had become a beloved hero whose death diminishes their community. Gilgamesh makes elaborate offerings to the gods of the underworld, presenting treasures and sacrifices to ensure Enkidu's comfortable existence among the dead. He calls upon Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, to welcome his friend. He invokes other deities associated with death and the afterlife, asking them to guide Enkidu through the darkness. These rituals demonstrate both affection for the dead friend and terror about what lies beyond life. Gilgamesh tries to influence through offerings what he cannot control through power. But the funeral rites, however elaborate, cannot resolve Gilgamesh's grief or answer the existential questions Enkidu's death has raised. After the ceremony concludes and Enkidu's body has been placed in its tomb, Gilgamesh cannot return to normal life. He wanders the wilderness surrounding Uruk, unable to eat or sleep, his appearance growing wild and unkempt. The king, who had always embodied civilization's power, now abandons civilized behavior, perhaps unconsciously seeking the wilderness existence that Enkidu once knew, trying to maintain connection with his friend by inhabiting similar spaces. More fundamentally, Enkidu's death has forced Gilgamesh to confront his own mortality in ways his previous philosophical reflections about fame, outlasting life, never achieved. Watching his friend die, seeing the mighty Enkidu reduced to cold clay, Gilgamesh cannot escape the recognition that he faces the same fate. The one-third mortality in his nature will ultimately triumph over the two-thirds divinity. Despite all his achievements, despite killing Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, despite being son of a goddess, Gilgamesh will die just as Enkidu died. This realization proves unbearable. In his anguish and terror, Gilgamesh conceives a desperate plan. He will seek out Utnapishtim, the one human who has escaped death's dominion. Ancient tradition records that Utnapishtim and his wife survived the great flood that destroyed primeval humanity, and the gods, in recognition of their virtue and the trauma they endured, granted them immortality. They now dwell at the ends of the earth, beyond the waters of death, in a realm ordinary mortals cannot reach. If Gilgamesh can find Utnapishtim and learn the secret of his immortality, perhaps he too can escape the fate that claimed Enkidu. This quest represents both heroic determination and profound desperation. Gilgamesh refuses to accept mortality even though every tradition and all human experience testifies to death's inevitability. His hybris, which previously manifested in oppressing his people and challenging the gods through killing Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, now drives him to seek what no other mortal has ever gained: escape from the human condition itself. The quest for immortality replaces the quest for fame, revealing that fame had always been merely a substitute for what Gilgamesh truly desired. life without end. Gilgamesh begins his journey into regions unknown, travelling beyond the boundaries of civilization into mythical realms that exist on maps of consciousness rather than geography. He comes first to the mountain pass called Mashu, where the sun enters the earth at night and emerges at dawn. Twin peaks of Mashu guard this passage, reaching to the sky above and to the underworld below. At the gate stand scorpion people, terrifying beings that are human above and scorpion below, whose glance alone brings death to ordinary mortals. When the scorpion man sees Gilgamesh approaching, he calls to his female counterpart, announcing that someone of divine flesh approaches, someone whose body is partly of the gods. This recognition saves Gilgamesh from immediate destruction. The scorpion people question him about his purpose, and he explains his quest to reach Utnapishtim and ask him about eternal life. The scorpion man warns that no mortal has ever travelled the path through the mountain, that it extends for 12 leagues of absolute darkness, that no light penetrates this tunnel where the sun travels during the night hours. Despite these warnings, Gilgamesh insists he must attempt the passage, driven by grief and terror that override all caution. The scorpion people, recognizing both his divine heritage and his determination, open the gate and allow him to enter. Gilgamesh begins walking through complete darkness, so absolute that he cannot see his hand before his face. The text describes his journey through this darkness in repetitive verses that emphasize the monotony and disorientation of travelling through absolute blackness. After 1 league, no light appears. After 2 leagues, still nothing but darkness. The repetition continues through all 12 leagues, creating a reading experience that mirrors the psychological experience of walking blind through endless night. This journey through darkness carries obvious symbolic dimensions. Gilgamesh descends into a realm associated with death, travelling the sun's nighttime path, experiencing the kind of absolute darkness that characterizes the underworld. His journey represents a descent into the unconscious, a confrontation with the deepest fears and ultimate realities that civilization normally holds at bay. The hero, who had always operated through strength and action, now must endure passive suffering, moving forward through faith rather than sight, stripped of the powers that had defined him. After 12 leagues, Gilgamesh finally perceives light ahead and emerges into a garden unlike any earthly place. This garden of the gods contains trees bearing jewels as fruit, lapis lazuli leaves, carnelian blossoms, pearls hanging like clusters of grapes. The beauty overwhelms description, presenting a paradise that exists beyond mortal reach, a place where the rules governing ordinary existence no longer apply. The garden suggests both the reward for enduring the tunnel's darkness and a threshold beyond which lies territory even more remote from human experience. In this jeweled garden, Gilgamesh encounters Siduri, a divine tavern keeper who dwells at the edge of the world. Different versions of the epic give varying accounts of this meeting, but the standard Babylonian version emphasizes Siduri's initial fear when she sees Gilgamesh approaching. His appearance has become wild and terrible during his wandering. His face looks haggard from exposure and grief. His clothing hangs in rags. He resembles a desperate wanderer or dangerous madman rather than a mighty king. Siduri bars her door and refuses to admit him. Gilgamesh must explain his identity and his quest before Siduri will speak with him. He recounts who he is, what he has accomplished, and why he now searches for Utnapishtim. He describes Enkidu's death in terms that reveal his continuing anguish. They did everything together, travelled every road, overcame every obstacle. But now Enkidu has become clay, and Gilgamesh himself must eventually suffer the same fate. The terror of mortality has consumed him, driving him to seek the one man who has escaped death's dominion. Siduri responds with words that constitute one of the epic's most famous and debated passages. In some versions, she counsels Gilgamesh to abandon his quest and instead embrace the life available to him. She tells him that the gods, when they created humanity, assigned death to humans and kept life in their own hands. No one escapes the fate the gods have decreed. She advises him to fill his belly with good things, to dance and make merry day and night, to wear fresh clothing, to bathe in clean water, to cherish the child who holds his hand, to delight in the embrace of his wife. These, she suggests, are the proper concerns of mortals, the sources of happiness available to human existence. This speech, sometimes called the Carpe Diem passage, articulates a philosophy of accepting human limitations and finding meaning in immediate sensory experiences rather than seeking transcendence. Siduri advocates for embracing the pleasures of embodied existence rather than striving against natural boundaries. Her wisdom reflects a pragmatic, life-affirming attitude that values joy in the present over anxiety about the future. Some scholars see in her speech a challenge to Gilgamesh's hybris, a reminder that even heroes must accept the human condition rather than attempting to transcend it. However, other versions of the epic, including fragments of earlier texts, suggest that Siduri offers more practical assistance with Gilgamesh's quest rather than philosophical counsel to abandon it. In these versions, she provides directions to Ushanabi, the ferryman who can navigate the waters of death to reach Utnapishtim's dwelling. This variation demonstrates how the epic evolved over time, with different editors emphasizing different themes. The tension between accepting mortality and striving for transcendence remains unresolved, reflecting perhaps an ambivalence in Mesopotamian thought about the proper response to death's inevitability. Gilgamesh, in any case, refuses to abandon his quest. Whether he ignores Siduri's philosophical counsel or simply follows her practical directions, he seeks out Urshanabi the ferryman. This search leads to another encounter shaped by Gilgamesh's wild appearance and desperate manner. When he finds Urshanabi in a forest near the shore, apparently gathering materials for his craft, Gilgamesh's aggressive approach causes destruction that complicates the journey. In his urgency or rage, Gilgamesh smashes what the text calls stone things that apparently play some role in navigating the waters of death. The exact nature of these stone things has puzzled translators and scholars. They might be stone anchors, stone idols that protect against the deadly waters, stone creatures that assist with navigation, or simply stone markers indicating safe passage. Whatever they are, their destruction creates a significant problem. Urshanabi explains that these objects allowed crossing the waters of death without touching the lethal water directly. Without them, the journey becomes far more difficult and dangerous. Nevertheless, Urshanabi agrees to ferry Gilgamesh across, perhaps moved by the hero's desperation or recognizing his divine heritage. They devise an alternative method for crossing. Gilgamesh must cut down numerous trees and shape them into punting poles, each pole to be used only once. As they cross the waters of death, Gilgamesh will push the boat forward with one pole, then discard it before it becomes too saturated with deadly water, and take up the next pole. This laborious method will require hundreds of poles, but offers the only remaining means to reach Utnapishtim's dwelling. The journey across the waters of death takes 3 days by one reckoning. Though time in these mythical regions may not follow normal patterns, Gilgamesh exhausts his supply of poles before completing the crossing, forcing him to use his own garment as a sail to complete the final distance. This detail emphasizes both his resourcefulness and his complete expenditure of normal means, arriving at his destination stripped of everything but determination and divine heritage. On the far shore, Utnapishtim sees the boat approaching and wonders who comes with Urshanabi. The ferry should carry only the dead to this realm beyond the waters of death, yet someone living and powerful stands in the boat. When they land, Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim regard each other with mutual curiosity. Utnapishtim appears as an ordinary man, showing no signs of the immortality the gods supposedly granted him. This ordinariness disappoints and perhaps frightens Gilgamesh. If the possessor of eternal life appears so unremarkable, what does this suggest about immortality itself? Gilgamesh introduces himself and explains his quest as he has done at each threshold of this journey. He recounts his friendship with Enkidu, their shared adventures, Enkidu's death, his own terror of mortality, and his desperate hope that Utnapishtim can reveal the secret of eternal life. His speech reveals the psychological journey he has undertaken alongside the physical journey. The king who once oppressed his people through excessive vigor, who sought fame through heroic deeds, who faced supernatural challenges with courage, now stands broken and desperate, begging for knowledge that might release him from the human condition. Utnapishtim's response contains both compassion and realism. He acknowledges Gilgamesh's suffering but questions whether anything lasts forever. Do we build houses that stand eternally? Do families remain united without end? Does the river in flood maintain its height forever? Everything in existence operates through cycles of creation and destruction, growth and decay, life and death. The gods established death alongside life when they created humanity. The day of death cannot be known in advance, but its eventual arrival remains certain for every mortal being. This philosophical discourse on impermanence reflects core Mesopotamian religious and philosophical thought. The universe operates through patterns of cyclical change rather than progressive development toward permanent states. Even the gods experience limitations and uncertainties. Death represents not a punishment for sin or a flaw in creation, but rather a fundamental aspect of the cosmic order that humans must accept rather than resist. Utnapishtim's words echo and expand upon Siduri's earlier counsel, presenting death as natural rather than tragic. Gilgamesh, however, refuses to accept these generalizations. He demands to know how Utnapishtim himself escaped the universal fate. If death claims everyone without exception, why does Utnapishtim live eternally? What makes him different? The hero's question reveals his continuing hope that some exceptional quality, some heroic achievement, some divine favor might provide escape from mortality. If one human has achieved immortality, surely others might do so as well, particularly one who possesses partly divine nature and has accomplished extraordinary deeds. Utnapishtim responds by telling his story, an account that occupies much of the 11th tablet and constitutes one of the earliest recorded flood narratives. His tale reveals that he gained immortality not through heroic achievement or supernatural qualities, but through surviving a catastrophe that destroyed all other humans. The gods granted him eternal life not as a reward he earned, but as compensation for trauma he endured, and perhaps also as a way of dealing with the uncomfortable fact that their plan to destroy humanity had partially failed. The flood story begins in the city of Shuruppak on the Euphrates River, back when the world was young and humans had multiplied across the earth. The gods, disturbed by humanity's noise and disorder, decided to destroy the human race through a great flood. This decision emerged from a council of the gods, with Enlil particularly insistent on human destruction. However, Ea, the wise god of freshwater and human crafts, opposed this plan. Unable to directly defy the council's decision, Ea found an indirect method to warn one worthy human. He spoke to the reed wall of Utnapishtim's house, ostensibly addressing the wall rather than the man inside, thereby technically not violating his oath to keep the god's plan secret. He warned that a great flood would come, that Utnapishtim should tear down his house and build a boat, abandoning possessions to save life, forsaking wealth to preserve his being. The boat should be constructed to precise specifications, cubic in shape with equal dimensions in all directions, with 6 decks dividing the interior into 7 levels, with internal walls and carefully sealed seams to make it watertight. Utnapishtim obeyed these instructions despite their strangeness and difficulty. He told his fellow citizens that Enlil hated him and he must leave the city, travelling to live with Ea in the realm of the Apsu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. This explanation allowed him to build the boat without revealing the coming disaster, though it involved deception that later troubled him. The entire city helped with construction, contributing materials and labour. Craftsmen sealed the seams with bitumen. Workers loaded provisions, food, beer, oil, and all necessities for a long voyage. When the boat was complete, Utnapishtim loaded aboard his family, his relatives, skilled craftsmen to preserve necessary knowledge, domesticated animals of every kind, and wild animals as well. The text emphasizes that he preserved life in its diversity, ensuring that the flood would not entirely eliminate the creations the gods had made. This concern for preservation contrasts with the gods' destructive intent, suggesting that human wisdom sometimes exceeds divine judgment. The flood came with terrifying intensity. The storm god Adad rode the tempest with thunder and lightning. The Anunnaki gods held torches setting the land ablaze. Darkness covered everything. Water rose from below and poured from above. For 6 days and 7 nights the flood raged with such violence that even the gods became frightened by what they had unleashed. The text describes the gods cowering like dogs, pressing against the outer wall of heaven, recognizing too late that destroying humanity meant destroying the humans who made offerings and maintained the gods through worship. When the storm finally subsided, silence covered the earth. Utnapishtim opened a vent and looked out at the world transformed. The flood had leveled everything, returning the earth to the primordial ocean from which it had originally emerged. All humans had turned to clay. The landscape lay flat as a roof. Utnapishtim wept at this total destruction, overcome by grief despite his own survival. He had saved his family and preserved life's diversity, but an entire world had perished, millions of humans who had gone about their lives unaware of the god's judgment. The boat eventually came to rest on Mount Nimish, which held it fast and prevented it from floating away as the waters receded. Utnapishtim waited 7 days, then released a dove to search for dry land. The dove found nowhere to land and returned. He released a swallow with the same result. Finally, he released a raven, which found dry land, discovered food, and did not return. This sequence demonstrated that the earth was becoming habitable again, that life could resume beyond the boat's confines. Utnapishtim then emerged from the boat and made offerings to the gods, setting up a sacrifice on the mountain's peak. The gods, who had been deprived of human offerings during the flood, smelled the sweet savour, and gathered around the sacrifice like flies, suddenly aware of what they had lost by destroying humanity. He reproached Enlil for causing such destruction without discrimination, suggesting that the guilty should be punished but the innocent spared, that humans might be reduced in number through disease, famine, or wild beasts rather than total annihilation. Enlil arrived at the sacrifice in anger, demanding to know how any humans had survived his judgment. When he learned that Ea had warned Utnapishtim, his rage increased. But Ea defended his action, arguing that Utnapishtim deserved to live because of his wisdom and righteousness. Unable to undo what had happened, Enlil made a remarkable decision. He boarded the boat and took Utnapishtim and his wife by the hands, touched their foreheads, and blessed them with immortality. Henceforth, they would be like the gods, dwelling far from other humans at the mouth of the rivers, at the ends of the earth. This transformation resolved the awkward situation the gods faced. They had intended to destroy all humans, but one couple had survived through divine intervention. Rather than correcting this failure by killing the survivors, Enlil removed them from the human category entirely, making them immortal and therefore no longer part of the noisy, troublesome human race that had prompted the flood. Utnapishtim's immortality thus resulted not from his achievement but from divine embarrassment and improvisation. The flood narrative contains obvious parallels to the biblical story of Noah, though significant differences exist in details and emphasis. The Mesopotamian version presents the gods as capricious and short-sighted rather than righteously judging human sin. E's deception in warning Utnapishtim contrasts with Yahweh's direct command to Noah. The gods' fear during the flood and their desperate hunger for human offerings afterwards reveal divine vulnerability unknown in the biblical tradition. These differences reflect distinct theological perspectives, with the biblical version adapted to monotheistic contexts that required very different explanations for divine motivation and cosmic order. After completing his story, Utnapishtim confronts Gilgamesh with uncomfortable questions. Who will assemble the gods on Gilgamesh's behalf to grant him immortality as they did for Utnapishtim? What extraordinary circumstance will prompt the gods to elevate another human beyond mortality? The implication is clear. Gilgamesh has no grounds to expect what Utnapishtim received. The flood was a unique event, unlikely to recur. The gods' decision to grant immortality represented an improvised response to unprecedented circumstances, rather than establishing a precedent others might follow. Yet Utnapishtim, perhaps moved by Gilgamesh's determination or testing his worthiness, proposes a challenge. If Gilgamesh seeks to live forever, he must first prove he can resist sleep for 6 days and 7 nights. Sleep, after all, is death's brother, a temporary cessation of consciousness that mimics mortality. If Gilgamesh cannot even resist sleep for a week, how can he hope to resist death forever? The test seems simple but reveals profound understanding of human limitations. Consciousness requires constant effort to maintain, and even the mightiest hero eventually succumbs to sleep's demand. Gilgamesh accepts the challenge confidently, certain his willpower can overcome this basic bodily need, but almost immediately after sitting down, sleep overwhelms him like a warm fog settling over him. He falls into deep slumber, exhausted by his long journey and the emotional intensity of his quest. Utnapishtim's wife watches him sleeping and suggests to her husband that they should wake him, allow him to return home, spare him the shame of failure. But Utnapishtim, perhaps with cruel kindness, insists that Gilgamesh must confront his limitation directly. To prove to Gilgamesh that he has indeed slept rather than merely resting briefly, Utnapishtim instructs his wife to bake a loaf of bread for each day Gilgamesh sleeps, placing them beside him in a row. Each day's loaf will decay at a different rate, providing visible evidence of time's passage. She bakes the bread as instructed, and the loaves accumulate, the first becoming hard and dry, the second becoming leathery, the third growing soggy, the fourth turning white with mould, the fifth developing grey spots, the sixth becoming rotten, the seventh still fresh from the oven. After 7 days, Utnapishtim finally wakes Gilgamesh, who immediately insists he had only just dozed off momentarily. Utnapishtim points to the row of bread loaves, their varying states of decay providing irrefutable evidence that a full week has passed. Gilgamesh looks at the physical proof of his failure and despairs completely. He recognizes that he cannot even conquer sleep, the temporary absence of consciousness. How then could he possibly overcome death, the permanent cessation? His quest has proven futile. All his strength and determination cannot alter the fundamental facts of human existence. In his anguish, Gilgamesh asks what he should do now, where he should go. Death has taken hold of his body. Wherever he walks, death walks alongside him. The recognition of mortality's inevitability crushes him more completely than any external defeat could have done. He has travelled to the ends of the earth, endured terrible hardships, and confronted his deepest fears, only to discover that what he sought cannot be obtained through any effort or achievement. Human existence operates within boundaries that even partly divine heroes cannot transcend. Utnapishtim instructs Shanabi to take Gilgamesh to the washing place, to cleanse him of the filth accumulated during his wanderings, to provide him with fresh garments and a headband that will remain perfect until he reaches home. This cleansing ritual suggests transformation, or at least transition. Gilgamesh will return to Uruk changed by his journey even though he has not obtained what he sought. The external cleansing symbolizes the internal process of accepting reality and reintegrating with civilized existence after his time in mythical realms. But as Gilgamesh prepares to depart, Utnapishtim's wife intercedes once more. She points out to her husband that Gilgamesh has come so far, endured so much, and should not return completely empty-handed. Her compassion prompts Utnapishtim to reveal one final secret. He tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the ocean, a plant with thorns like a rose that will prick the hands of whoever grasps it. This plant has remarkable properties. It can restore youth to the old, giving back lost vitality. Though not granting immortality itself, it offers a kind of renewable life, the possibility of returning to youth repeatedly, and thus postponing death indefinitely. Gilgamesh seizes this information with desperate hope. Though he has failed the test of sleeplessness, though he cannot achieve true immortality, perhaps this plant offers an alternative path to extending life beyond normal human span. He thanks Utnapishtim and departs with Shanabi, heading for the location Utnapishtim described. When they reach the place, Gilgamesh ties heavy stones to his feet and descends to the ocean floor. There, in the depths, he finds the plant and grasps it despite its thorns piercing his hands. He cuts the stones from his feet and rises to the surface. Clutching the precious plant he will call, the old man becomes young again. Returning to shore with his prize, Gilgamesh explains his plan to Shanabi. He will carry the plant back to Uruk and give it to the elders there, letting them eat it first to test its properties. If it truly restores youth, then Gilgamesh himself will eat it, and return to the vigor of his early manhood. This decision reveals important character growth. The Gilgamesh who oppressed his people and thought only of his own glory now considers sharing this precious discovery with others, testing it on the elderly before claiming it for himself. The journey has begun transforming him from a self-centered tyrant into a leader concerned with his people's welfare. The return journey proceeds without incident until they stop to rest at a pool of cool water. Gilgamesh, hot and tired from travel, decides to bathe in the pool. He places the plant carefully on the shore while he enters the water, but a serpent, attracted by the plant's fragrance, emerges from the pool and steals it, consuming it immediately. As the serpent retreats into the water, it sheds its skin, demonstrating the plant's power to renew life. The snake that took the plant gains the ability to renew itself periodically through shedding its skin, a quality snakes possess to this day according to ancient Mesopotamian understanding. Gilgamesh, discovering the theft, sits down and weeps. All his efforts, all his suffering, the entire dangerous journey to the ends of the earth have produced nothing. He obtained the plant of renewal only to lose it through a moment's inattention. Even this lesser prize, this compromise alternative to true immortality, has been taken from him. He has failed utterly and completely in his quest to escape mortality's boundaries. The tears he sheds acknowledge not just the loss of the plant, but the collapse of hope that had sustained him through his journey. Yet this final failure paradoxically brings a kind of resolution. Gilgamesh must now accept absolutely what he had been trying to deny. He will die as all humans die, his divine heritage notwithstanding. No quest, no achievement, no plant or secret knowledge can alter this fundamental reality. The recognition proves devastating, but also liberating. Once hope of transcending mortality has been definitively crushed, Gilgamesh can turn his attention to what remains possible within mortal existence. Gilgamesh and Ur-Shanabi complete their journey back to Uruk. As they approach the city, Gilgamesh invites the ferryman to climb the city's walls and observe their grandeur. He describes the walls in terms that recall the epic's opening, creating a circular structure that returns the narrative to its beginning. The walls extend for a certain distance, built of baked brick with foundations deep in the earth. The city contains temples, orchards, and clay pits, all properly proportioned and organized. Gilgamesh's pride in these walls reveals his shifted perspective. Unable to achieve immortality himself, he finds meaning in the enduring structures he has built, the city that will outlast him. This return to the physical walls of Uruk represents acceptance of the limitations Siduri had articulated earlier in the epic. The proper concern of mortals is not transcending death, but rather creating meaning within finite existence. Gilgamesh has built walls that will shelter his people for generations. He has established a city that embodies order, culture, and civilization's highest achievements. These accomplishments, while not granting personal immortality, create a legacy that transcends individual mortality. The king who sought to live forever learns instead to find meaning in contributions to collective human existence. The standard Babylonian version's 12th tablet, added after the main narrative's conclusion, returns to material adapted from the old Sumerian poem Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld. This tablet seems structurally separate from the preceding 11, creating scholarly debate about whether Sinlekyonini included it in his original compilation or whether it was appended later. The content contradicts the main narrative since it depicts Enkidu as alive and journeying to the underworld rather than having died earlier in the story. Most scholars treat it as an appendix that preserved important material about the afterlife, while not fully integrating it into the epic's narrative flow. In this tablet, Enkidu ventures into the underworld to retrieve objects that Gilgamesh has somehow lost there. Before Enkidu descends, Gilgamesh provides detailed instructions about proper behavior in the realm of the dead. Enkidu must not wear clean clothes, anoint himself with oil, carry weapons, make noise, or behave in any way that would distinguish him from the dead themselves. He must not kiss his wife or children, strike those he hates, or embrace those he loves. The living must appear as similar to the dead as possible to avoid attracting dangerous attention in that shadowy realm. Enkidu, whether through forgetting these instructions or through deliberate choice, violates every prohibition. He wears clean clothes, anoints himself with fine oil, carries weapons, makes noise, and expresses his emotions freely. The underworld seizes him as a result, refusing to release him. Gilgamesh attempts various means to free his friend, appealing first to Enlil, then to Sin, without success. Finally, Ea intervenes, instructing the hero Nergal to open a hole in the earth through which Enkidu's spirit can emerge temporarily to speak with Gilgamesh. Enkidu's ghost rises from the underworld, and the friends embrace, though whether this embrace is physical or spiritual remains unclear. Gilgamesh questions Enkidu about the conditions of the dead, asking him to describe what he has seen. Enkidu responds that he cannot speak of it, that if he told Gilgamesh what he observed, the king would sit and weep all day. But Gilgamesh insists, and Enkidu proceeds to describe the various fates awaiting different types of dead. The account that follows provides crucial information about Mesopotamian beliefs regarding the afterlife. Enkidu describes how a man's condition in death depends largely on how he died and what happened to his body afterward. A man who died naturally and received proper burial, with sons to make offerings, exists in relative comfort, drinking fresh water and eating good bread. A man killed in battle, whose body was recovered and buried properly, enjoys support from his parents and wife. Each category Enkidu describes reveals the ancient conviction that relationships with the living, particularly through burial rites and offerings, directly affect one's experience in the realm of the dead. But the descriptions grow progressively grimmer. A man whose body lies abandoned in the field finds no peace. His spirit wanders restlessly, unable to enter the organized underworld. A man who died with no one to care for his body eats garbage and scraps, the refuse left in pots. A man who had no children has no one to make offerings, and thus exists in the most pitiable condition of all. The emphasis throughout is on the importance of maintaining connections between the living and the dead through ritual obligations. The afterlife appears not as a realm of individual reward or punishment for moral behavior, but rather as a social space where one's status depends on the continuing attention of living relatives. This glimpse into the underworld reinforces themes present throughout the epic. Death does not provide escape or transformation, but rather a continuation of existence in diminished form. The dead remain conscious enough to experience their condition but lack the vitality and possibility that characterize life. They depend utterly on the living for whatever comfort they receive, creating obligations that bind generations together. The best fate one can hope for is proper burial and descendants who maintain offerings, ensuring at least basic dignity in the shadowy realm. The addition of this material, whether by Sinleki Unini or a later editor, serves important purposes despite its narrative awkwardness. It provides explicit information about the afterlife that the main narrative only hints at. It reinforces the value of proper social relationships, particularly family ties and burial customs. It reminds the audience that even after death, humans remain dependent on community and tradition, that individual existence never becomes truly independent even in the realm beyond life. The themes running throughout the Epic of Gilgamesh have resonated across centuries and cultures, explaining the text's continuing relevance despite its ancient origin. At its core, the epic explores the human confrontation with mortality, the most universal and unchanging aspect of human existence. Every person, regardless of time period or cultural context, must eventually face death. The epic examines various responses to this fundamental reality: denial, bargaining, quest for transcendence, and ultimately acceptance. Gilgamesh's journey from terror to wisdom models a psychological and spiritual process that remains deeply relevant. The exploration of friendship provides another enduring theme. The relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu demonstrates how profound human connection can transform individuals, providing meaning that transcends personal concerns. Their friendship allows both heroes to become more than they were in isolation. Gilgamesh gains compassion and purpose beyond selfish ambition. Enkidu gains purpose and participation in civilization's achievements. The depth of Gilgamesh's grief after Enkidu's death testifies to friendship's transformative power, while also revealing how loss can catalyze personal growth and wisdom. The tension between civilization and nature pervades the narrative from Enkidu's transformation through his ultimate death. The epic examines what humans gain and lose through civilization. Enkidu's story suggests that entering civilization means sacrificing innocent harmony with nature in exchange for knowledge, relationships, and cultural participation. But this exchange proves ambiguous rather than clearly positive or negative. Civilization brings both benefits and costs, enriching human existence while creating new vulnerabilities and sorrows. The epic acknowledges this complexity without resolving it into simple judgments. The relationship between humans and gods throughout the epic reveals ancient Mesopotamian religious sensibilities, while raising questions that transcend particular theological systems. The gods appear as powerful but flawed beings whose decisions sometimes seem arbitrary or unjust from human perspectives. They create humans to serve their needs but become annoyed by human noise and disorder. They send catastrophic punishments but then regret their decisions. They grant immortality capriciously while denying it to worthy petitioners. This portrayal might seem irreverent, but it actually reflects sophisticated religious thought that acknowledge divine mystery and the limits of human understanding regarding cosmic justice. The theme of transformation through suffering provides perhaps the epic's deepest wisdom. Gilgamesh begins as a figure of raw power and overwhelming vigor, exercising his extraordinary abilities without wisdom or restraint. His friendship with Enkidu begins the process of tempering his excesses, but only Enkidu's death and the failed quest for immortality complete his transformation into a wise king. The suffering he endures, both in grief and in confronting his own inevitable death, proves necessary for achieving wisdom that his godlike power alone could never provide. The epic suggests that wisdom requires accepting limitation and loss rather than constantly seeking to transcend boundaries. The structure of the hero's journey in the Epic of Gilgamesh established patterns that would recur throughout world literature. The initial call to adventure when Enkidu arrives in Uruk, the journey to the cedar forest that takes the heroes beyond civilization's boundaries, the death of the companion that transforms the quest's nature, the descent into darkness and symbolic realms of death, the meeting with guides who offer wisdom, the tests that reveal the hero's limitations, and the return home transformed though without the prize initially sought. All these elements appear in countless later narratives across different cultures. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides what may be the earliest complete example of this archetypal pattern. The literary techniques employed in the epic demonstrate remarkable sophistication for such an ancient text. The use of repetition with variation creates both structure and emphasis, allowing audiences to recognize patterns while noting significant changes that reveal character development or shifting circumstances. Dreams and omens throughout the narrative provide foreshadowing while revealing ancient understandings of how the divine communicates with humans. The shifts between divine and human perspectives allow the audience to see events from multiple angles, understanding motivations and consequences that individual characters cannot fully grasp. The epic's treatment of kingship and proper rule gains significance when understood within ancient Mesopotamian political contexts. Gilgamesh begins as a tyrannical king who abuses his power, oppressing the very people he should protect. His transformation through friendship, loss, and failed quest leads him to understand kingship differently. The wise king who returns to Uruk after his journey takes pride in the city's walls and structures that benefit his people rather than in personal glory or power. The narrative suggests that proper rule requires wisdom born from suffering and acceptance of limitation, rather than merely strength and divine favor. The cultural impact of the Epic of Gilgamesh extends far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. The flood narrative within the epic, predating the biblical account by at least a millennium, demonstrates the shared cultural heritage of the ancient Near East. The motifs and themes found in Gilgamesh influence later literary traditions, though direct influence often remains difficult to prove definitively. The figure of the hero seeking immortality, the faithful friend who dies tragically, the wise counselor who offers guidance the hero initially rejects, the journey to the ends of the earth in search of answers to life's ultimate questions. All these elements recur throughout world literature in ways that suggest, if not direct influence, at least common human concerns finding expression through similar narrative patterns. The Epic of Gilgamesh influenced later Mesopotamian literature significantly. References to Gilgamesh appear in numerous other cuneiform texts, treating him as a historical figure whose deeds set precedents for later rulers. The flood story appears in several other Mesopotamian contexts, including the later poem known as the Atrahasis epic, which provides an alternative account of human creation and near destruction. The figure of Gilgamesh as a judge of the dead appears in underworld texts, suggesting his transformation from historical king to legendary hero to deity involved multiple stages and contexts. The discovery and gradual translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh during the 19th and 20th centuries had profound impacts on biblical scholarship and ancient Near Eastern studies. George Smith's initial discovery of the flood narrative in 1872 sparked intense debate about the relationship between biblical texts and earlier Mesopotamian traditions. The recognition that the flood story existed in Mesopotamian literature before being incorporated into Hebrew scriptures challenged traditional views about biblical uniqueness and prompted more sophisticated understanding of how ancient texts developed through cultural contact and literary borrowing. The ongoing discovery of additional fragments and versions of the epic continues to refine scholarly understanding. Tablets found at various ancient sites across Mesopotamia, including locations far from the original Assyrian and Babylonian centers, demonstrate how widely the epic circulated in ancient times. Hittite and Hurrian translations found in Anatolia show that the epic transcended linguistic and cultural boundaries, being adapted into different languages while maintaining its core narrative. These discoveries reveal the Epic of Gilgamesh as not merely a Mesopotamian text, but as a genuinely international work of ancient literature. The process of translating the epic into modern languages has proven challenging and continues to evolve. Early translators, working from fragmentary texts and imperfect understanding of cuneiform languages, produced versions that sometimes filled gaps with conjecture or imposed modern sensibilities onto ancient material. As more fragments have been discovered and linguistic understanding has improved, translations have become more accurate and nuanced. Contemporary translators face ongoing decisions about how literally to render ancient poetry, whether to maintain the formulaic repetitions that characterized oral tradition, and how to balance scholarly accuracy with literary accessibility. Different modern translations emphasize different aspects of the epic. Some prioritize literal accuracy, attempting to convey as precisely as possible the meanings and structures of the original Akkadian text. Others prioritize literary quality, creating versions that read as compelling poetry in English or other target languages, even if this requires departing somewhat from literal translation. Still others attempt to split the difference, providing accurate translations that also achieve some literary merit. Each approach offers distinct advantages and limitations, and readers benefit from consulting multiple translations to gain fuller understanding of this complex ancient work. The fragmentary nature of the surviving texts creates additional challenges for modern readers and translators. Despite the relatively complete state of the standard Babylonian version from Ashurbanipal's library, significant gaps remain where tablets are broken or text is illegible. Translators must decide whether to leave these gaps blank, acknowledge them with ellipses or brackets, or attempt to fill them based on context or parallel passages from other versions. These editorial choices significantly affect how audiences experience the narrative and understand its themes. The Epic of Gilgamesh has influenced modern literature in numerous direct and indirect ways. Many contemporary authors have written retellings or adaptations that update the ancient story for modern audiences. These range from faithful recreations that attempt to preserve the ancient narrative while making it accessible to contemporary readers, to loose adaptations that use the characters and basic plot as starting points for entirely new stories. The epic's themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning have proven endlessly adaptable to different cultural contexts and literary styles. Notable modern literary works that engage directly with the Gilgamesh epic include Herbert Mason's verse narrative from 1970, which presents a highly literary English version emphasizing the emotional and philosophical dimensions of the story. John Gardner and John Meyer produced a scholarly translation with extensive commentary that has served generations of students and general readers. More recently, Stephen Mitchell created a popular version that reads as fluid narrative poetry while remaining grounded in scholarly translation. Each of these works has introduced the ancient epic to new audiences and sparked renewed interest in Mesopotamian literature. The epic has also influenced modern works less directly, through the archetypal patterns and themes it established. The buddy narrative in which two contrasting figures form deep friendship while undertaking dangerous adventures appears throughout modern literature and film, from adventure novels to action movies. The quest narrative in which a hero journeys beyond the known world in search of answers to existential questions pervades serious literature and popular entertainment alike. The transformation of a flawed protagonist through suffering and loss into a wiser, more compassionate figure follows patterns the Epic of Gilgamesh helped establish more than 3,000 years ago. Contemporary philosophers and psychologists have found rich material in the epic for exploring fundamental human concerns. Existentialist thinkers have examined how the epic portrays human freedom and the creation of meaning in the face of mortality. The text's unflinching acknowledgement that death cannot be escaped or transcended through any achievement aligns with existentialist emphasis on accepting authentic existence within finite boundaries. Gilgamesh's transformation from seeking external solutions to his terror of death into accepting his limitations while finding meaning in his contributions to civilization models a process existentialist philosophy advocates. Psychological interpretations have analyzed the epic through various theoretical lenses. Jungian approaches see in Gilgamesh's journey a representation of individuation, the process through which the conscious ego integrates with the unconscious to achieve psychological wholeness. Enkidu might represent the shadow, the rejected wild aspects of Gilgamesh's nature that must be integrated rather than suppressed. The journey to Utnapishti represents descent into the unconscious, confronting archetypal figures and ultimate realities that transform consciousness. The return to Uruk reflects the integration of these experiences into conscious life. Grief and trauma studies have examined how the epic portrays loss and mourning. Gilgamesh's response to Enkidu's death demonstrates stages of grief that remain recognizable: denial, anger, depression, and eventual acceptance. His inability to accept his friend's death, his desperate quest to reverse mortality, and his ultimate recognition that death cannot be undone reflect processes that bereaved individuals still experience. The epic's portrayal of how profound loss can catalyze personal transformation and deeper wisdom offers insights that remain relevant for understanding human psychological processes. The Epic of Gilgamesh has entered popular culture through various media adaptations. While no major Hollywood film has yet presented a faithful adaptation of the complete epic, elements and characters appear in numerous films, television shows, video games, and graphic novels. The challenges of adapting this ancient text for visual media include its episodic structure, its mythological elements that might seem strange to modern audiences, its philosophical concerns that resist simple dramatic presentation, and its ending that provides wisdom rather than conventional triumph. Several anime and manga series have drawn inspiration from the epic, particularly in Japan, where ancient mythology maintains strong cultural presence. These adaptations often emphasize the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the heroic battles against monsters, and the quest for immortality, while sometimes downplaying the philosophical themes or altering the ending to provide more conventional resolution. The visual medium allows for spectacular presentation of the cedar forest, Humbaba, the bull of heaven, and the jeweled garden of the gods. Video games have incorporated Gilgamesh and elements of his epic into various fantasy role-playing contexts. The Fate franchise presents Gilgamesh as a powerful ancient king with supernatural abilities, though the characterization often emphasizes his arrogance and power rather than his wisdom and transformation. Other games use the epic's elements more loosely, featuring characters named after figures from the story, or quests inspired by episodes like the Journey to the Cedar Forest, or the Search for the Plant of Immortality. The academic study of the Epic of Gilgamesh spans multiple disciplines and continues to produce new insights. Assyriologists and ancient Near Eastern specialists analyze the cuneiform texts themselves, working to establish accurate readings of damaged passages, comparing different versions to understand the epic's evolution, and situating it within broader Mesopotamian literary traditions. Literary scholars examine its narrative techniques, thematic development, and influence on later literary works. Comparative mythologists study how its patterns and motifs appear in other cultural traditions. Religious studies scholars have examined the epic's theological dimensions, including its portrayal of divine human relationships, its treatment of the afterlife, and its engagement with questions about divine justice and cosmic order. The text provides invaluable evidence for understanding ancient Mesopotamian religious thought, while also raising questions about how religious ideas develop and change across cultures. The relationship between the Gilgamesh flood narrative and biblical accounts continues to generate scholarly discussion about literary borrowing, common oral traditions, and how similar stories adapt to different theological frameworks. Anthropological approaches have analyzed what the epic reveals about ancient Mesopotamian social structures, gender roles, and cultural values. The text provides information about kingship ideologies, the relationship between urban civilization and wilderness, attitudes towards sexuality and its civilizing function, the importance of burial customs and ancestor veneration, and concepts of heroism and proper masculine behavior. While the epic must be read carefully as a literary text rather than a straightforward historical document, it nevertheless offers windows into the cultural world that produced it. The question of the epic's original performance context remains somewhat uncertain but significant for interpretation. Was it recited in royal courts as entertainment and instruction for rulers? Was it performed in temple contexts as part of religious observances? Was it taught in scribal schools primarily as an educational text for learning cuneiform? Evidence exists for all these contexts, suggesting the epic may have served multiple functions across different settings. The formulaic repetitions and episodic structure suggest roots in oral tradition, while the sophisticated literary techniques demonstrate skilled authorial shaping. The Epic of Gilgamesh raises important questions about authorship and textual development that complicate modern assumptions about literature. Unlike most modern texts that have clear individual authors, the epic evolved through multiple stages involving numerous contributors. The oral poets who first shaped stories about the legendary king, the scribes who first wrote down Sumerian poems, the compiler of the Old Babylonian version, Sin-Lekiu-Nini, who created the standard Babylonian version, and the various scribes who copied and perhaps modified the text over centuries. This collaborative evolutionary process better reflects how most ancient literature developed than modern models of solitary authorship. The preservation of the epic across millennia depended on numerous contingencies that easily might have resulted in complete loss. Clay tablets, while durable under proper conditions, remain fragile and easily destroyed by fire, water, or simple carelessness. The decision by Ashurbanipal to include the epic in his library proved crucial for its survival, as most earlier versions exist only in fragments. The tablets then lay buried for more than 2,000 years before modern archaeology recovered them. Even after recovery, the epic's modern reception depended on the development of cuneiform decipherment. If scholars like Henry Rawlinson and Edward Hincks had not succeeded in decoding cuneiform writing systems in the mid-19th century, the tablets from Ashurbanipal's library would have remained unreadable. George Smith's particular genius for assembling fragments and recognizing narrative patterns proved essential for reconstructing the epic from broken pieces. Each stage in this long chain of preservation and recovery involved elements of chance alongside deliberate human efforts to preserve knowledge. The continuing discovery of new fragments demonstrates that our understanding of the epic remains incomplete and subject to revision. Tablets discovered at archaeological sites in recent decades have filled some gaps, while sometimes creating new questions about variant versions and the epic's textual history. The possibility remains that future excavations might uncover additional manuscripts that significantly alter scholarly understanding of the text. This openness to revision distinguishes ancient literary studies from work with texts that survive in complete, stable forms. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides crucial evidence for understanding the development of writing and literature itself. The transition from oral to written tradition, the evolution of writing from administrative tool to medium for literary expression, the development of libraries and scribal schools, the emergence of concepts like authorship and textual canon, All these fundamental developments in human cultural history can be traced through the epic and related Mesopotamian texts. The epic stands near the beginning of literature as a distinct human activity separate from purely functional communication. The question of what makes the Epic of Gilgamesh literature rather than merely an ancient story has generated considerable scholarly discussion. The text demonstrates conscious artistic shaping rather than simply recording traditional tales. The sophisticated structure, the careful development of themes through repetition and variation, the psychological depth of characterization, the integration of philosophical reflection with narrative action. All these qualities mark the epic as a deliberate work of literary art rather than a simple compilation of legends. Sinleki Unini deserves recognition as an author in the fullest sense, not merely a compiler or scribe. The universal themes embedded in the epic explain its continuing resonance, despite the vast historical and cultural distance separating modern readers from ancient Mesopotamia. The confrontation with mortality remains as immediate for contemporary individuals as it was for ancient audiences. The search for meaning in a finite existence, the value of deep friendship, the tension between civilization and nature, the limits of human power, the necessity of accepting what cannot be changed. These concerns transcend particular cultural contexts to address fundamental aspects of human existence. The epic's treatment of transformation through acceptance rather than conquest offers wisdom particularly relevant for contemporary culture. Modern Western societies often emphasize overcoming obstacles, achieving goals, and refusing to accept limitations. The Epic of Gilgamesh presents an alternative model in which wisdom comes through recognizing and accepting boundaries rather than constantly struggling to transcend them. Gilgamesh's growth from a hero who seeks to conquer death into a king who finds meaning in mortal accomplishment models a psychological and spiritual maturation that remains profoundly relevant. The relationship between the Epic of Gilgamesh and environmental consciousness has attracted increasing attention in recent decades. Enkidu's transformation from wild man to civilized companion, the killing of Humbaba who guards the sacred forest, the destruction of ancient cedars for building projects, these elements can be read as exploring humanity's changing relationship with nature through the development of civilization. The epic does not present simplistic judgments about whether civilization represents progress or loss, but rather acknowledges the complexity and ambiguity of humanity's separation from natural existence. Modern readers might see in Humbaba's death a cautionary tale about destroying nature's guardians and exploiting sacred resources for human purposes. The fact that Humbaba's killing brings divine punishment suggests ancient awareness that such violations carry consequences. Yet the epic also celebrates the city walls and architectural achievements that require those cedar logs, acknowledging that civilization's benefits depend on transforming natural resources. This tension between valuing nature and building civilization remains unresolved in the epic, reflecting perhaps an honest acknowledgement that no simple resolution exists. The Epic of Gilgamesh has become a standard text in world literature courses, introducing students to ancient Mesopotamian culture while demonstrating literature's capacity to transcend historical boundaries. Teaching the epic presents both opportunities and challenges. Students often find the ancient cultural context strange and difficult, requiring considerable background information to understand references to Mesopotamian gods, burial practices, and social structures. Yet the core narrative and themes typically prove immediately accessible, demonstrating how fundamental human concerns find expression across radically different cultural contexts. The epic serves pedagogical purposes beyond its literary merits. It introduces students to the ancient world's complexity, challenging simplistic narratives about human progress that might view ancient peoples as primitive or unsophisticated. The text demonstrates that humans 4,000 years ago grappled with the same existential questions that concern contemporary individuals, that they possessed psychological depth and philosophical sophistication comparable to any modern person. This recognition can foster humility and cross-cultural understanding valuable far beyond literary studies. The question of how to read ancient texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh raises important methodological considerations. Should we attempt to understand the text as ancient Mesopotamian audiences would have, reconstructing their cultural assumptions and interpretive frameworks? Or should we read it from contemporary perspectives, allowing it to speak to current concerns, even if this means imposing meanings the original authors never intended? Most scholars advocate for a both approach, combining historical scholarship that seeks to understand the text in its original context with literary interpretation that explores its continuing relevance. The Epic of Gilgamesh demonstrates literature's capacity to preserve and transmit cultural values, historical memory, and philosophical wisdom across vast spans of time. The scribes who copied the text century after century, the libraries that preserved it, the scholars who translated and interpreted it, all participated in an extended conversation spanning millennia. Modern readers who engage with the epic join this conversation, bringing new perspectives while connecting with fundamental human concerns that transcend particular historical moments. The legacy of the Epic of Gilgamesh extends beyond its specific narrative to encompass what it represents. Humanity's earliest surviving extended literary work, a testament to the ancient world's cultural sophistication, a bridge connecting modern readers with the deep past. Its survival against enormous odds suggests something about its intrinsic value, its capacity to speak meaningfully across cultural and temporal boundaries. The epic endures not merely as a historical artifact, but as a living text capable of engaging contemporary readers and offering wisdom relevant to current lives. As we conclude this exploration of the Epic of Gilgamesh, several profound insights emerge from its ancient wisdom. The text reminds us that human beings have always confronted fundamental questions about meaning, mortality, friendship, and proper living. The specific cultural forms through which these questions are explored may differ across time and place, but the questions themselves remain constant. Gilgamesh's journey from powerful but unwise king to a ruler who understands human limitations and finds meaning in mortal accomplishment models a maturation process that remains relevant. The epic teaches that wisdom comes not from avoiding loss and suffering, but from engaging deeply with these inevitable aspects of human existence. Gilgamesh's transformation occurs precisely through the experiences he would have preferred to avoid. Enkidu's death, his own failed quest, the recognition of his mortality. These painful experiences prove necessary for achieving the wisdom that allows him to return to Uruk as a truly great king rather than merely a powerful one. The text suggests that we grow through confronting what we most fear rather than through constantly seeking security and comfort. The portrayal of friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu demonstrates how profound human connection can transform individuals and provide meaning that transcends personal concerns. Their relationship changes both heroes, allowing each to become more than he could have been in isolation. The depth of Gilgamesh's grief testifies to how fully he invested in this friendship, while his subsequent quest demonstrates how loss can catalyze personal growth. The epic suggests that risking the pain of loss is worthwhile because the alternative, avoiding deep connection to protect oneself from grief, would mean missing the experiences that make life most meaningful. The tension between accepting mortality and seeking transcendence runs throughout the epic without reaching simple resolution. Gilgamesh's quest for immortality represents human refusal to accept natural limits, a striving for more than nature allows. This striving drives achievement and exploration, pushing humanity beyond comfortable boundaries into new realms of possibility. Yet the quest's ultimate failure teaches that some boundaries cannot be transcended, that wisdom requires distinguishing between limits that can be overcome and those that must be accepted. The epic honors both the striving and the acceptance, suggesting that both impulses serve important functions in human life. The Epic of Gilgamesh remains relevant today because it addresses concerns that remain central to human existence, despite vast changes in technology, social organization, and cultural context. We still struggle with mortality, seek meaningful relationships, wonder about proper living, and question the relationship between individual desire and communal responsibility. The ancient Mesopotamian world that produced the epic has vanished, but the fundamental aspects of human existence it explored continue to define our lives. The epic's survival across 4,000 years testifies to literature's capacity to preserve and transmit wisdom across cultural and temporal boundaries. For modern readers encountering the Epic of Gilgamesh, the text offers both a window into the ancient world and a mirror reflecting contemporary concerns. We see in Gilgamesh's journey elements of our own struggles to find meaning in finite existence, to maintain important relationships despite inevitable loss, to achieve wisdom through experience rather than merely accumulating years. The epic reminds us that humans have always faced these challenges, that our ancestors thousands of years ago possessed the same emotional depth and philosophical sophistication we experience today. The continuing scholarly work on the epic, including ongoing discoveries of new fragments and refined translations, ensures that our understanding of this ancient masterpiece continues to develop. Each generation of scholars and readers brings fresh perspectives, finding new meanings and connections that previous readers might have missed. This interpretive richness demonstrates great literature's inexhaustibility, its capacity to reward repeated engagement and to speak meaningfully to diverse audiences across different contexts. As we reflect on the epic of Gilgamesh's extraordinary journey through time, from oral tradition in ancient Sumer, through written forms in various languages, buried beneath Mesopotamian ruins for more than 2 millennia, rediscovered by Victorian archaeologists, translated into modern languages, and now studied and celebrated worldwide, we recognize something remarkable about human culture's capacity to preserve and transmit its greatest achievements. The epic's survival depended on countless individuals making choices to value, preserve, and transmit it. The ancient scribes who copied tablets, the kings who built libraries, the modern scholars who deciphered cuneiform, the teachers who share it with students. Each participant in this chain of transmission contributed to ensuring that Gilgamesh's voice continues speaking across the ages. The Epic of Gilgamesh stands as humanity's oldest surviving great work of literature, a testament to the ancient world's cultural achievements and a bridge connecting us with our distant ancestors. Its themes of friendship, mortality, the search for meaning and wisdom through acceptance remain as vital today as when the story first took shape more than 4,000 years ago. As we read Gilgamesh's tale, we participate in a conversation that has continued for millennia, adding our voices to those of countless readers before us, while passing the story forward to future generations who will find in it their own meanings and wisdom. The journey from Gilgamesh, the oppressive king, to Gilgamesh, the wise ruler, parallels the journey each person must undertake from youth's certainty and ambition to maturity's acceptance and wisdom. We all must eventually confront mortality, experience loss, recognize our limitations, and choose how to create meaning within finite existence. The epic suggests that this journey, however painful, leads to wisdom and authenticity that make life meaningful. Gilgamesh's transformation from seeking to transcend humanity to accepting and honoring his human nature offers a model for personal development that remains profoundly relevant. In the end, the Epic of Gilgamesh teaches that meaning comes not from escaping the human condition, but from fully embracing it, from building cities and walls that will outlast us, from forming deep friendships despite their inevitable end, from seeking wisdom through experience rather than trying to avoid suffering, and from finding beauty and purpose in finite existence, rather than constantly grasping for immortality. These lessons, carved in cuneiform on clay tablets 4,000 years ago, buried beneath desert sands for millennia, rediscovered by scholars in the modern era, continue to offer wisdom for anyone willing to listen to humanity's oldest story. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the entire history of the Epic of Gilgamesh. If you found this exploration of humanity's oldest epic enlightening, please consider liking this video and subscribing to History for Narration for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped human civilization. Share your thoughts about the epic in the comments below. What aspects of Gilgamesh's journey resonated most with you? Until next time, may you find wisdom in the stories of the past and meaning in your own mortal journey.